The Lone Warrior by Paul Fraser Collard. Read by Dudley Hinton. Chapter 1. Calcutta, May 1857. Good evening, Sahib. Welcome to the circle. The doorman pressed his palms together and bowed at the waist. The namaste was delivered with perfect politeness, but the smile under the golden pagdi was fixed in place, and there was no sign of it in the man's eyes as they ran quickly over the figure that stood before him. The tall, dark-haired Englishman nodded in acknowledgment of the greeting. His lean face revealed nothing of what he thought, his grey eyes emotionless as they assessed the two guards who hovered behind the more elegantly dressed doorkeeper. "Is this your first visit to the circle, Sahib?" The Englishman gave the slightest shake of his head. "No." "Then I must thank you for your custom. This way, please." The doorkeeper took a half-pace backwards and bowed for a second time, this time sweeping his arm in a theatrical gesture of welcome before waving away the bearers of the palki that had brought the sahib to the door of the exclusive club. One of the two guards stepped to one side and opened the single door to the building behind them. There was no prominent signage displaying the club's name. Indeed, if it were not for the presence of the smartly dressed doorkeeper and his guards, it was unlikely any passer-by would notice the unassuming side entrance that now opened for the Englishman. Yet the circle displayed its status in other ways. It did not blend well into its surroundings. The building was grand, the four stucco columns in front of it mimicking the style of the Palladian mansions built by the British in their part of town. It stood aloof from its neighbours, a mismatched collection of drab mud and thatch buildings that clung to its skirts like so many peasants begging alms from a lord. But the entrance to the secretive club was hidden away, so that only those who were aware of its existence would know where to request entry. The circle was a respectable venue, but an exclusive one, open only to the wealthiest locals and a select handful of British officers and senior officials who sought a more colourful flavour to their entertainment. The Englishman walked through the open door without hesitation. It led to a tiny corridor no more than 3 yards long. He did not turn round as the door behind him shut to leave him entombed in the tiny space. He faced the far end, looking at the second door that waited for him, hiding his tension behind a facade of calm indifference. He took a pace forward, standing tall as he felt a hidden scrutiny. His hand fell to his side, the fingers twitching as they failed to locate the handle of the sword they had instinctively expected to find there. No one was allowed to wear a blade in the circle, but that did not mean everyone was unarmed, and the Englishman had to resist the urge to reach inside his heavy black dinner jacket and caress the cold, hard lump of the revolver stuffed into his cummerbund. The seconds passed, the passage of time marked by the slow tick of a clock on the wall of the corridor. For such a tiny space, it was surprisingly elegant. The floor was of white marble, with the walls painted a dark crimson. A dozen small but fine paintings decorated each wall, but there was no window. The elegance was as much of a facade as the Englishman's confidence, the confined space designed to hold a single guest while they were assessed through the gilded lattice grilles that were spaced at regular intervals along the walls. The Englishman refused to turn his head to search for a flicker of movement behind the screens. Instead, he waited, patiently, standing stock still as he felt the hidden eyes roving over him. He tried not to think what it would be like to fight his way back through the entrance, telling himself there had to be another way out, an easier escape route to be found away from the public entrance to the club. The door in front of him opened. "Good evening, Sahib. Welcome back to the circle." The keeper of the second door was dressed in identical fashion to his colleague outside, even down to the same faux smile fixed on his face. The Englishman grunted once in recognition of the second greeting. Without waiting to be invited, he marched forward, sweeping past the doorman and into the main reception room. He did his best not to show any emotion as he emerged into the graceful surroundings that welcomed guests after their temporary incarceration. The room was spacious and bright, with elegant candelabra competing with vividly painted Chinese lanterns to fill the space with light. The rich decor reminded him of a Maharaja's palace. The walls were painted a neutral alabaster, with sweeping curtains of a simple white fabric smothering the dozen wide windows that were screened by grass tatties but otherwise left open. The cooling breeze that flowed into the room was circulated by the pankawulas sitting silent in the corners. The door frames were of teak, decorated with elegant carvings depicting myriad flora and fauna, the intricate work the product of exquisite skill. The floor was of marble, the wide white expanse only broken by the fabulous splashes of colour provided by a single enormous and gaudy Kalim rug positioned in the very centre of the room. It was a place of airy refinement and comfort, a haven of tranquillity away from the bustle and chaos of the teeming city of Calcutta. "This way, Sahib." Another well-dressed servant arrived to usher the Englishman into the room. "Allow me to get you something to drink." The Englishman let himself be led through the first reception room and into another, decorated in the same elegant style. Unlike the first, it contained a long mahogany table decked out with a full and inviting banquet. He recognized little. The dishes of unidentifiable stews and biryanis a feast for any guest arriving with a hunger for more than the other entertainments for which the circle had earned its reputation. "Would you care for a drink, Sahib? We have the very best French champagne. Or would you prefer a whisky? We have Kinnahans from Dublin or Encore from Leith." "Beer." The Englishman pursed his lips before turning his back on the overloaded table and walking towards another doorway on the far side of the room. The servant fluttered his hands nervously and scurried forward to keep pace with his much taller guest. "Something to eat, Sahib? If you do not see anything to your taste, we would be only too delighted to prepare something more delectable for your palate." The Englishman said nothing. He lifted his hand and used it to lever the over-attentive servant to one side, then strolled into the next room, drawn by the gentle murmur of voices that echoed through into the elegant reception spaces. The gaming room smelt of money. Not the kind found in the great houses hidden in the depths of the English countryside, or on ostentatious display in the fabulous surroundings of a Maharaja's palace. This room promised something much more fleeting. It smelt of rhino. It smelt of cash. A few of its occupants turned, acknowledging the presence of the stranger before quietly returning to their games, the lure of the cards of so much more interest than the arrival of a Farangi. The Englishman smiled. The familiarity of the scene was reassuring, the gentle voices of the croupiers calling out the score echoing those he had heard in the more respectable clubs of Calcutta, the muttered phrases the same as in any room where French hazard was played. The focused stares of the players did not change, no matter what the colour of the gamers' skins, their silent concentration adding intensity to the room, so that a tense atmosphere simmered just beneath the cool air and graceful elegance. Servants lined the walls, standing like so many bronze statues as they waited to cater to their patrons' every whim. A dozen or more young boys sat in the corners, their heads bowed low as they pulled on the thick silk ropes that controlled the huge sail attached to the ceiling. Other servants glided past, moving silently around the periphery to douse the grass tatties that covered the open windows. The fibres were kept wet, cooling the hot breeze that billowed in and adding a delicate scent that helped to mask the smell of sweat and overripe flesh. The sweet, smelling air flowed around the room, making the chandeliers chime, their glass droplets coming together to create a gentle melody that underscored the hushed voices of the patrons and the staff who served them. A servant appeared at the Englishman's shoulder, a single glass held up on a silver salver. The crystal was misted, its sides lined with fine droplets of moisture, the promise of the cool drink it contained written in the thin ring of water around its base. The dark amber liquid within tantalized the Englishman, and he reached for it gratefully, immediately taking a deep draught, his eyes closed in silent ecstasy. He felt the girl's gaze rest upon him before he saw her. He looked across the room and caught the mocking stare sent in his direction. The look sent a shiver down his spine, and he lowered the glass, the bitter taste paling against the spark of excitement that the single glance had aroused deep in his being. The girl turned away, her eyes flickering over the cards she flipped from the heavy wooden shoe beneath her wrist. It was as if she had not seen him, his presence as unremarkable as that of any of the eager-eyed babas sitting at her table. But the Englishman had seen the glimmer of fear in the fleeting contact, and he felt it spark the kindling of anxiety that had been building deep in his gut. "Another beer, Sahib?" The question was innocent, but there was a wry amusement in the words. The drink swallow had seen the target of the Englishman's stare, and he acknowledged what he believed to be the white-faced foreigner's desire with a knowing smile. "No." The Englishman turned away. The heat of his fingers had caused the moisture on the crystal glass to run, and he felt it cold and wet on his palm. He walked quickly towards the table where the doe-eyed girl was at work. His free hand strayed unconsciously to the bulk of the revolver pushed hard into the waistband of his black dress trousers. He stopped and swept his eyes round the room. His hand left the hidden weapon and ran over his close-cropped hair. He lifted the glass to his lips and drained the last of its contents. For a moment he contemplated the bottom of the glass, as if trying to discern his future in the frothy residue left behind. Then he placed it on the green baize of the table and smiled. "Let's go." He said the words with the calm authority of an officer, the clipped urbane tone of a man who expected to be obeyed without hesitation. The girl looked up, her eyes wide in surprise. She gazed at the Englishman as if seeing him for the first time. The grey eyes that stared back at her were composed, the man's face, with its thin growth of beard and the tiny silver scar that ran under the left eye, betraying nothing but indifference. Then she moved. She slammed the wooden card shoe onto the table and came to the side of the man who had interrupted the game, slipping her hand into his. She barely reached his shoulder, and was forced to crane her neck as she contemplated the tall Englishman who had arrived to throw her life into turmoil. The mismatched couple walked briskly across the room. The Englishman's foot caught a spittoon placed close to a fat babu who chewed unceasingly on betel. The china vessel cracked as it hit the man's chair leg, the sound echoing like a gunshot. As if on cue, the place erupted into noisy confusion. The first voices were raised as the players at the girls' table saw their croupier leaving on the arm of the Farangi. Servants rushed forward, eager to subdue the sudden hiatus, their soothing voices adding to the noise that had destroyed the tranquility of the room. The Englishman and the girl he was rescuing did not stop to admire the chaos they had caused. It was time to make good their escape, whilst they still could. Chapter 2. "We need a way out." The Englishman hissed the words without breaking step. ignoring the bubbling hookah that he knocked over in his haste. The girl was forced into a trot to keep pace with her rescuer. "This way." She pulled on his arm, tugging him to one side and towards a discreet doorway in the far corner of the room. "Sahib!" A servant stepped into their path, his hands raised as he tried to bring them to a halt. The Englishman barged past, his shoulder thumping hard into the fool who had thought to delay him. The man staggered to one side and the couple continued, their pace increasing as they made for the door. They stepped around the incredulous Pankawulas who looked up aghast as the pair rushed past, their arms still working in unison despite the shock of what they were seeing. The girl pulled the door open, revealing the gloomy servants' corridor behind. She darted inside, pulling the Englishman with her. He resisted her urgent summons and paused to look back at the room they had thrown into confusion. A sea of dark faces was turned his way, every expression betraying anger at the disturbance he had created. He could see the servants rushing to and fro as they tried to calm their guests, their hurried gait such a contrast to the calm, serene progress he had witnessed earlier. He also noticed the arrival of 3 of the circle's guardsmen, their hands clutched tightly around the hilts of the heavy tulwars buckled to the sashes round their waists. "Come on, you fool!" The girl pulled hard on his wrist, and he let himself be led into the passageway. She tugged him forward, increasing their pace so that they rushed through the dimly lit corridor, his boots echoing loudly on the tilted floor. There was none of the splendour of the public rooms in the tight passage. Guests were not expected to enter the hidden workings of the circle, and the decor reflected the practical nature of their escape route. They moved quickly, the girl leading. Twice they heard the sound of footsteps scurrying past in adjacent corridors, but they slipped along without encountering anyone coming the other way. "You came!" The girl panted the words over her shoulder as she ran, pausing to glance around a corner before pulling him forward once more. "I promised, didn't I?" The Englishman sounded affronted at having been doubted. "Men promise many things." The girl stopped suddenly. She turned to face him, the whites of her eyes bright in the gloom. "You came!" The Englishman reached forward and took her in his arms, crushing her to him. She kept her face lifted towards him, and he looked down at her, seeing the wonder written there. "I keep my word." Her brown eyes sparkled with delight. She whooped, a single explosion of joy, her mouth opening wide as she released her excitement. The Englishman smiled and pushed her away from his embrace. "You'd better show us the way out, love, or we aren't going anywhere." She laughed. It came from deep in her throat and it captivated him, just as it had when he had first met her only a few weeks previously. He had not expected to become infatuated with a woman. He had been drinking away the hours, waiting for the carriage to collect him and take him down to Garden Reach and the Peninsula and Orient steamer that would take him on to the next leg of his journey back to England, and a home he hadn't seen for years. Then he met the girl, and everything had changed. "Yes, sir." She offered a mock salute and turned to lead him on. She'd taken no more than 3 steps before she turned back and quickly kissed him on the lips. "You came, Jack. You came." Jack Lark tasted her lips, then laughed as she pulled away. He was creating chaos and stealing a girl from men who thought of her as nothing more than one of their possessions. It was madness, sheer idiot folly, and it felt glorious. They ran hard over the tiled floor, doorways and other passages flashing past as they raced by. "Stop!" The bellowed command echoed down the corridor. The couple slewed to an awkward halt and skidded into a large, barrel-vaulted room at what Jack guessed was the rear of the house. He saw a door to the outside on the far side of the room, but there were 6 grim-faced guards blocking their path. Jack and the girl had moved fast, but the circle's guards and management had thought faster, assembling a small army to block the club's rear exit. "Stay behind me." Jack stumbled on his words, his breath rasping in his throat after their madcap dash. He gently pulled on the girl's arm, tugging her backwards as she stepped towards the men who stood between them and freedom. He sucked in a lungful of the warm air. It was far hotter in the areas of the club where only the servants existed. There were no grass tatties or willing pankawulis here, and he felt the sweat running freely down his body. He wiped his hand across his face, slicking away the worst of the moisture from his eyes. "Stand aside." He gave the command in as level a tone as his ragged breathing would allow. He had not come seeking a fight. A thin, waspish man stepped forward. He was razor-thin and dressed simply but elegantly in a kurta with wide-bottomed pyjamas. The fine orange sash wrapped around his waist matched the colour of his tightly bound pagdi. The armed guards parted, easing out of his way and leaving no doubt in Jack's mind that the man was in command. "You appear to be trying to take something that is most precious to us, Sahib." The man spoke slowly, as if the Farangi might struggle to understand the words. His English was perfect, and for the first time Jack began to wonder just who he had decided to make his enemy. "The girl wants to leave." Jack's reply was curt, the words delivered flatly and without emotion. "I would suggest that you do not stand in our way." The man laughed, or at least gave the impression of doing so, for there was no humour in the bitter sound, and his eyes flashed in anger as he took a single pace towards the couple, who still held hands, their chests heaving with the exertion of their attempted escape. "The girl cannot make that choice, Sahib. She belongs to us. You cannot own her. She has the right to choose." The thin-faced man's eyes narrowed. "She was bought. We own her. There is no choice." Jack felt the small hand clasped in his begin to tremble. He wanted to comfort her, to reassure her that all would be well, but he could not risk taking his eyes off the man who confronted them. He squeezed her hand once before he let it go, moving his own so that it hovered near the opening of his jacket and close to the handle of the hidden weapon that he had brought for just such an eventuality as this. "We are leaving. Tell your men to stand aside. I will not give you another chance." Again the man laughed, his grating chuckle. He stared at Jack, saying nothing, but anger simmered in his eyes. "Kill them both." He spoke the words calmly, as if ordering nothing more than a peg and soda. Then he slipped back through his guards and left the room by another doorway, the request clearly of insufficient importance to detain him any longer. The 6 guards took a pace forward. As one, they pulled their tulwars from their leather scabbards. The blades flashed in the light spilling into the room from a line of thin windows, and the guards all slipped into a fighting stance as they started to edge forward. Jack felt nothing as he regarded the naked steel. "Is there another way out?" he asked his companion, without looking away from the tulwars coming towards him. "No." The voice was small, timid. He nodded. "Then we shall leave this way." His hand slipped around the handle of his gun. It was a Dean & Adams 5-shot revolver. He didn't trust it completely. It had failed him before and had nearly cost him his life. But it had also killed more men than he cared to remember, and as his fingers touched the cold metal, he felt the tension slip away. He drew the gun smoothly and raised it, his arm extending as he aimed the barrel at the closest guard. "Stand aside, now." He strode forward, his movements quick and commanding. He waved the gun as he moved, sweeping it from side to side to cover the group of guards, who saw an easy killing slip away, a quiet murder replaced with the threat of their own death. He used his free hand to shove the closest man away from him decisively, trying to awe them with his purposeful actions. "Move! Look lively now!" He forced the guards backwards, threatening them with the gun, aiming it at the nearest men's faces. "Move! Move!" He caught his companion's eye. "The door!" The girl, who had stood in mute horror as her rescuer marched towards the men ordered to kill them, sprang to life, rushing to the door, her hands grasping for the bolt. It was too much for the guard closest to her. He slashed his tulwar at the girl, who screamed and twisted away, the blade missing her by no more than an inch. Jack did not hesitate. He swung the gun round and fired. The crash echoed around the room. The bullet smashed into the wall in front of the guard, gouging a thick crevice in the whitewashed plaster, the crack of the impact loud an instant after the cough of the revolver. "The door!" Jack yelled the words again. Already the other guards were moving, galvanized into action by the gunshot. They came forward in a rush. The first tulwar thrust at Jack's ribs, and he twisted quickly to one side, letting the blade slide past him before he bludgeoned his elbow forward, catching the guard in the face. The man fell, and Jack leapt over him, roaring a wild cry as he dodged past another fast-moving tulwar that scythed through the air in front of him. He grabbed the nearest wrist with his left hand, pulling its owner sharply forward before chopping the revolver downwards and cracking the metal hilt into the guard's skull. He spun away before the man had time to fall, and battered another guard's tulwar to one side with the barrel of the gun. He stepped forward and slammed his forehead into the man's face, a fleeting glimpse of horrified astonishment registering in his mind before his vision swam with the force of the impact. "Look out!" Jack's skull hurt from the headbutt, but he heard the warning cry and threw himself to one side in time to see the bright flash of a tulwar as it cut through the air where he had just been standing. He threw the revolver up and fired again. There was no time to aim, but the threat was clear, and the guard who had attacked him leapt backwards as he tried to escape the bullet that scorched through the air before burying itself in the ceiling. "Get back!" Jack bellowed the command, then fired twice more in quick succession, cowing the three guards who were still standing. They retreated, their desire to fight the Farangi fading fast. The girl threw back the bolt and opened the door. Overheated air rushed into the room, spreading the powder smoke that hung in clouds. "Stay back!" Jack roared. He had no idea if the guards understood his words, but they backed away, refusing to come close to the madman who was still waving a loaded revolver in their direction. The girl reached out and grabbed Jack's wrist, pulling him away, leading him out into the blazing heat. The moment they were outside, they ran, a wild, careering gallop through the rancid back alley behind the splendid building that housed the circle. They laughed as they went, the joy of the escape released as they raced away. Chapter 3. Did I kill any of them, do you think? No, you missed. You are not such a good shot, I think. Jack laughed. I meant to miss. Those poor buggers didn't deserve to die for that nasty, skinny bastard. The palki pitched and heaved as they rounded a sharp bend. The four bearers must have wondered at the sanity of the couple who had emerged from a dank side alley to throw themselves inside. But Jack had overpaid them to kill their curiosity, and so they had taken the odd passengers willingly. It was cramped inside the palki, but Jack didn't mind. It was no hardship to be confined with such a beautiful companion. You still hit them. They'll live. The girl pulled her long silk scarf around her, as if suddenly cold. A man has never fought for me before. Then you have lived a sheltered life. Jack stared back at her. Her brown eyes were huge, her fear still bright inside them. She was a creature from a beautiful dream, her face perfectly symmetrical. He didn't think he had ever seen anyone so perfect, but it was her eyes that captivated him the most. They were so alive. He felt the flutter of a memory stir in his head, but forced it away, determined to live in the present and not the bitter past. He stared at her beauty, using it as a balm to calm his mind, to force away the memories that haunted him. "You should not stare so." The reprimand was given gently. He smiled. Her accent was a constant delight. The English words took on a whole new dimension when she spoke them. The rolling sounds warmed as she ran them around her tongue. "You are beautiful. I cannot help it." The girl blushed. 2 points of colour flared high on her cheeks, the hue bright against her dusky skin. "Is that why you rescued me?" Jack sat back, easing his battered head into the cushions that were piled at one end of the palki. It hurt, a painful reminder to never again be foolish enough to use it as a weapon. "I told you I would come for you." The girl wriggled forward so that she sat next to his head. She reached across, her finger tracing the yellow and blue bruise that was already showing in the centre of his forehead. "Men make many promises when they're drunk." "I was never drunk." "No? Well, not completely." "Yet, still, you came." She spoke in a hushed tone now, as if not able to understand what had just happened. "Of course." "Why?" The question hung in the air between them. Jack did not have an easy answer. He had seen her barely a dozen times, each time she had been working, serving in the hotel where he'd been staying, which he had discovered to be owned by the same men who ran the circle. He had followed her to the club, passing an evening at her table. They had barely spoken, but for some reason he could not understand, he had felt a connection, sensing something between them more than just polite formality, and he had spotted her fear. She seemed so sad and lost that he felt tied to her, no matter that he did not even know her real name. The silence stretched out. He wished he could explain why he had rescued her, but he did not understand it himself, and the words would not come. "I am in your debt." She broke the silence. "I thought about escaping, but I saw what they did to other girls who tried." Her voice trailed off. She looked away, hiding the fear that had yet to leave her. "One of my friends took that path. They cast her body out and let the dogs eat it. I was not brave enough to go that way." "Then I'm glad I got you out of there." "Why would you do that for me?" She looked at him again. "Is it not enough that I came?" The girl considered. She scrutinized his face, as if searching for the answer. "Yes." She turned away and spoke in little more than a whisper. "You saved me. I was their possession, nothing more. They thought of me as a pretty decoration with no more value than a beautiful painting. I was there to look pretty and to smile at the men who came, no matter how ugly they were, or how much they stank." Jack said nothing. He reached for her, his hand grazing her shoulder, but she shrugged it off, not wanting his touch. "I always knew that when my beauty faded, I would no longer be useful to them. I'd seen it happen before to the girls who were there before me. If I was lucky, I would have married one of the guards. Some of them were kind to me. Some were nice." Her voice wavered, but she did not stop. "Otherwise, one of the leaders would have taken me for a while at least." After that I would have been given to the women upstairs, the ones who serve any who can pay. I might have been there for a year, perhaps 2. Then, when the last of my beauty had faded, or if I got with child, I would have been thrown out to work on the streets. She turned to look at him once again. Her face was smeared with tears, her skin blotchy and creased. That would have been my fate, Jack. So yes, I am grateful. I owe you my life. She said nothing more, hiding her face in her hands. He reached for her again, and this time she did not push him away. He lifted her face away from her hands and stroked a finger down her cheek, her tears cold on his skin. You asked me why I came for you. He paused as he summoned the courage to carry on and reveal the sorry truth. I had nothing else. I'm a thief. I steal people's lives, or at least I did. I don't have to anymore. He offered a half smile as he thought of Major Ballard. After fighting for the Empire under the stolen names of other men for 2 years, Jack had been given back his identity. The British intelligence officer had handed him a set of discharge papers in his own name, a reward for a job well done. At the time, Jack had been delighted, sensing a way to leave his life as an imposter behind. He had not fully understood quite what that would mean. He let go of her and looked away, unable to meet her searching gaze. He had gambled his new future on a wild escapade, when any sane man would have translated the fleeting looks and muttered conversations he had shared with the beautiful girl as nothing more substantial than the gossamer thin veil she had worn. It was the act of a fool, and it shamed him. I was alone, he continued, unable to hold back his confession. I wasn't a soldier anymore, even a fake one. I was just me. He looked back, seeing she had not moved, and I had nothing. So, you risked your life to rescue a woman you did not know? Yes. He became more animated now. I didn't think about it. I just knew I had to do it. I had to do something, even if it meant fighting, even if it meant dying. The words rushed out like a battalion of redcoats unleashed to the charge. I needed a purpose. I saw you and I realized how sad you were, how frightened, so I decided to get you out, to give you a new life, and I loved every bloody second. He could not stop now. The words had opened his soul, revealing the rotten core hidden inside. Something happens to me in battle. I know I can fight. I know I can kill, but it's more than that. It's who I am. Sometimes I believe it's the only thing about me that's real. And God help me, I want it. I want to fight just so I can prove myself. He sank back into the cushions. He had never spoken like this before. You are a fool, Jack Lark. There are easier ways to get a woman on her back. He laughed, the bitter spell broken by her mockery. He reached out and took her hand as he rebuilt the barriers in his mind, sealing off his blackened soul. I knew you wanted to leave, he said. You told me so yourself. Her smile was barely there. I did not expect you would be foolish enough to come and take me away. Then you do not know me. Jack's smile was quick, hiding his emotions. It was easy to be glib. No. Her voice was serious. I do not know you. But I do know that they will come for you now. They are dacoits, and they will not leave you unpunished for what you have done. They will know what steamship you are on, where you are going, when. You are in danger now. Then I'll go someplace else. Jack's voice caught in his throat. He had been lost, but now he had been found. It doesn't matter. He looked at her. Where will you go? I will go home. The answer came quickly. She was certain in what direction her own future lay. "I could take you, if you like." "It is a long way. You have done enough for me. I could not ask that of you." Jack lay back. He considered the idea. He had no plans other than a vague notion to return to London, to a mother he had not seen for years. He was in no hurry. No career beckoned, no friends waited to welcome him home. He was alone, without a future or even much of a prospect of one. Until now. He smiled. "I've decided. I'll take you home." "I warn you, it is a long journey." "I would travel to the edge of the earth to be with you, love." "Fine." She laughed at something in his earnest expression. "You can take me to Delhi." "Delhi?" Jack sat up quickly, something he immediately regretted as his vision swam. "It's at least 1,000 bloody miles away." "You said you would travel to the edge of the earth for me?" The girl giggled as she teased him. "But now 1,000 miles is too far?" Jack threw back his head and laughed at the madness of what he had done. He had not felt like this for as long as he could remember, and he savoured the sensation. He had forgotten what it was to be so alive. He reached across and took the girl's hands in his own. "I shall take you to Delhi. But first you must do one thing for me." She watched him closely, her face suddenly guarded as she waited to hear the price she must pay. Jack smiled at her expression. "You must tell me your real name." The girl laughed, her hands leaving his and rising to cover her mouth. Then she paused, hesitating as she considered the request. "The men who took me told me to forget my name." Her voice was small as she answered him. All signs of her laughter had disappeared. "They called me Saruda, named for the goddess Saraswati. All the girls were named for the gods. We were not allowed to use our given names. We had to forget who we were, who we had been before." She lifted a hand and wiped eyes that were suddenly brimming with tears before touching her throat as she tried to compose herself. It took a moment, but when she had herself under control, she fixed Jack with a smile that sent a shiver running down his spine. "You fought for and rescued a girl without knowing her name. You are a strange man, Jack Lark." She paused, shaking her head at his folly before looking him straight in the eye. "My name is Amira, and I thank you for saving my life." Chapter 4. The Grand Trunk Road, May 1857. Jack pulled back the curtain that passed for a window in the dak gharry and sighed. The view was the same as it had been hours earlier, and it was unlikely that it would be any different the next time he stirred himself from his torpor and bothered to look again. They had been on the road for a week, and his senses had been dulled into submission. What interest there had been in the suburbs of Calcutta half forgotten now they were far from civilization. Now only matted jungle smothered the land, the twisted greenery of the tangled foliage stretching as far as he could see. Dense, thorny undergrowth formed an impenetrable barrier alongside the edge of the road. Vines entwined around the bamboo and forest trees as if choking them back, the low-growing scrub jealously trying to tether its taller neighbours to the ground. Despite such cloying attention, the trees soared up, breaking free of the lush melee and fighting their way through the dense canopy to reach the distant sky. In a few rare places, sly, fetid creeks wound their way alongside the road, the air above them teeming with a million insects. The dak would be attacked by a swarm of tiny bodies, the air so thick that it was hard to breathe. Jack and Armourer would be forced to hide their faces away, burying them in the duck's pillows until the vehicle was far enough away for the plague to subside. Every so often the road passed through a tiny village. There was little to recommend the dank and squalid mud communities, but Jack would always relish the chance to see the local people, even the meanest collection of houses inhabited by a vast multitude of men, women, and children. At every village, armies of naked children would dash out and run alongside the duck, creating an energetic spectacle as they cavorted at the roadside. Otherwise, there was little to see, the repetitive scenery causing the days to merge into one, the tedium only interrupted by the overnight stops at the ubiquitous caravanserai that waited to greet a weary traveller at the end of the day. The backdrop might have been monotonous, but the great road teemed with life. They had passed a dozen bullock carts in the last few hours, the drivers hunched against the sun, their animals plodding through the stupefying heat. Dozens of natives walked alongside the road, their bright pagdis and saris adding splashes of vibrant colour against the ever-present greenery. The previous day they had travelled alongside a column of sweating sepoys, the sight of the armed men a reminder that the road was the lifeline of the country. For the thousands of men stationed up country, the Grand Trunk Road was the only road in and the only road out. For decades, British regiments had traipsed along its length, the footsore soldiers pounding their way over the thousands of miles that separated the great ports of Calcutta and Bombay from the hundreds of cantonments and garrisons dotted throughout the enormous country. On 2 occasions their vehicle had been forced from the road, detouring around the gangs of native labourers working to the orders of the scarlet-faced British engineers who were engaged in a constant battle to keep the vital artery flowing. Such work was of the utmost importance. Without the Grand Trunk Road, the 3 presidencies of Bombay, Bengal and Madras would be nothing more than disconnected settlements, the power of unified government lost in the vast distances that separated the 3 great colonial capitals. "You're letting in the dust." Armourer sounded as bored as Jack felt. He closed the curtain and fell back onto the cushions and pillows that lined the inside of the duck gharry. It was a comfortable way to travel, if you could afford it, with plenty of space for 2 passengers to lie back and relax. He didn't mind spending the money. He had plenty, the legacy of his one attempt at burglary. He thought of Abdul El Amir, the owner of the inappropriately titled Hotel Splendid in Bombay. Abdul had tried to have Jack murdered. His reward was a beating and the loss of the valuables that now resided in the vaults of Cox and Cox in Jack's own name. The army's agents were well used to dealing with all manners of objects appropriated by the officers of both the Queen's Army and the East India Company. Life in India offered numerous opportunities for reward, and there were many respectable agencies ready to help turn such objects into a healthy cash deposit, for a reasonable fee, of course. Jack reached across and poked his companion in the side. He was rewarded with a snort of disapproval, and he smiled. It was hard to find too much to dislike about their journey. The scenery might have been about as varied as a monk's wardrobe, but he could not find the will to complain when he was able to share the experience with such a beautiful travelling companion. He nestled back into the pillows before lolling lazily onto his side and reaching across to her. He used a single finger to gently push back the thick strand of dark hair that whispered across her face. His finger caressed her skin, a feather-like touch as he traced a pattern across her cheek. She closed her eyes. "That's nice, Jack. You can keep doing that." He obeyed, adding more of his fingers, moving them slowly across her face, his touch like gossamer. She smiled, relaxing. Jack stared at her in rapt fascination. He could not recall ever having seen a woman as beautiful. "Don't stop." He could not help laughing. His fingers had slowed as he contemplated her face, and she was ordering him to continue, unwilling to forgo the intimate touch. She opened one eye as she heard him chuckle. "And what are you finding so funny?" "Nothing, love. You lie back and take it easy now." The single eye narrowed. "Why am I suspicious of a man telling me to lie back? Do you think I am some kind of backstreet houri?" This time he could not contain a guffaw. "I apologize. I will attend to my duties with more diligence in the future." He spoke in the clipped, urbane tones of the upper class, an accent that he regularly slipped into despite the fact that he no longer wore the uniform of an officer in the British Army. It was taking him longer than he had imagined to forget the character he had lived with for so many months and years. He might no longer exist under an assumed identity, but he was discovering that being plain Jack Lark took as much of an effort of will as it had done to assume a rank and a station that was not his own. "You've done it again." Armourer opened both eyes to plead with Jack as he once again allowed his fingers to still. "Am I to be your servant now?" he teased her. "You might want to sound a little more grateful. I should have been on a bloody ship by now, not stuck in the arse end of nowhere attending on you." "It was your own doing." She teased him back in equal measure. "It was not. You're the one who wouldn't leave me alone." "I was working. It was my job to be nice to you, Farangi." "Now you tell me." Jack pulled his hand away. "So I shouldn't have bothered rescuing you?" "Do you regret it?" She continued to tease him, but some of her playfulness was gone. Not for a second. It was Jack's turn to be more serious. "You've given me back something I thought I'd lost. I should be the one thanking you." Armourer nodded. "Yes, I like that answer." She lay back, arching her spine like a cat. "It is so very hot in here. Do you not think so?" "It is hotter than Hades." The moment he spoke, Jack felt a shiver run down his spine. The words reminded him of another life, and of a battalion laundry where the air was hot enough to leave a permanent flush on the faces of the young girls who toiled at the great boiling coppers. Armourer reached out for him, her fingers warm on his skin. "It really is so very hot. Would you help me out of these clothes? I think I will be happier without them." Jack looked down and saw what she had in mind. The memories of his past fled as he leant forward, and once again began to do as he had been told. The sound of shouting woke Jack with a start. He'd been dozing. The hottest months of the year were some way away, yet the heat still built steadily through the day, and the soporific motion of the duck usually lulled him to sleep during the sweltering hours either side of midday. The vehicle came to an abrupt halt, and both occupants were thrown forward, their rest coming to a sudden and painful end. "What the hell?" Jack cursed as he banged hard into the far wall of the travelling compartment. He threw back the curtain. The light seared into his eyes with all the force of a canister of grape shot, the gloom of the interior blasted aside by the fierce midday sun. He looked out in time to see the driver and his two assistants rush past, their legs pumping furiously in a state of obvious terror. The native men, women and children journeying on foot near the duck were scattering to the wind, abandoning the road and the luckless Farangi. He searched ahead, his heart pounding as he looked for whatever had caused such sudden horror. He blinked hard, his eyes protesting at the glare. He could make out a cloud of dust moving towards them at speed. Whatever it hid was closing on the abandoned carriage fast. He thrust his head and shoulders out through the tangle of thin sheeting that passed for a window. "Come back!" he yelled, knowing it would do no good. The servants were already a dozen yards away, and it was clear they would not stop until either their legs or their hearts gave out. He faced the onrushing cloud of dust. Through the murk he saw what had caused such panic, and he understood immediately why the Duck's crew had fled. He pulled himself back inside and reached for the knapsack that had fallen to the floor when the carriage had been brought to a chaotic halt. "What is it?" Armourer grabbed at his shoulder. He shook off her hands and rummaged through his pack, scattering his few belongings in every direction. He muttered curses as he worked, berating himself for his stupidity. He had become complacent. He had learnt the hard way never to be unprepared for a fight, but the long, dreary days had deadened his sense of danger, and he had let his guard down. He would now pay the price for his foolishness. "Jack!" Armourer sounded more angry than scared. "Get up on the roof." Jack grabbed the objects he had been searching for. He turned and thrust Armourer towards the opposite window. "Up there! Look lively now!" Fear surged into his gut. He had forgotten the force of the feeling, the icy rush that flooded his body, the squirm in the very depth of his being as death arrived to sit at his shoulder once again. He made sure Armourer was obeying his command before he reached down to snatch his sword from the floor. His hand clasped the mottled red grip. The sharkskin was worn, in places rubbed raw from where he had held it clenched in his hand as he fought. The feel of it against his skin kindled memories of the battles he had survived, the ones he tried to keep locked away in the darkest recesses of his mind. He had killed many men with the blade. The tulwar rasped from its leather scabbard, the steel flashing once in the strong sunlight that now flooded the interior of the Duck. It was a fabulous weapon. Its edge was bright, and a tight flowing script was etched deep into the face of the blade. It was the weapon of a prince, a legacy of his time in the service of a rebellious Maharaja. The steel felt alive in his hand, as if a wanton spirit had been bound in the steel and was now released as the need to fight once again arrived. Jack pushed himself out of the window and clambered up onto the roof of the Duck to join Armourer. He risked a glance forward and cursed as he saw that the danger was close. A band of Gujjar tribesmen were rushing towards the stranded vehicle. The Gujjar were lawless robbers who plagued the roads between the large garrison towns scattered along the Grand Trunk Road. The driver and his men had done the sensible thing by fleeing at the first glimpse of the hard men from the hills. Jack knew he no longer had the same option. The fast-moving bandits were sure to be upon them before he and Armourer had gone more than 100 yards. So he had decided to make a stand. The outcome was likely to be the same, but at least he would have the satisfaction of not being run down like a rabid dog. It was time to reveal his bitter talent. It was time to fight. Chapter 5. A fiery wind beat against Jack as he staggered upright on the Duck's roof, the searing heat scalding his unprotected face. He looked across and saw Armourer struggling to get to her feet, so he reached for her hands and hauled her up, careless of her yelp of protest. "Brace yourself. Quick now." His voice rasped as he snapped the order. He saw the first flare of fear in her eyes, but there was no time to reassure her, and he turned away, assessing the bandits who were storming towards them. The Gujars were running hard. Their long kurtas billowed around them, the once white robes stained grey with dust and grime. The heavily bearded faces beneath the tightly bound pagdis snarled in anger, their teeth bared as they rushed to attack the foolish travellers who journeyed alone. Jack cursed as he counted a dozen men charging towards them. He did not fear a fight, but against such odds he knew the chance of survival was poor. He turned and saw the colour drain from Armourer's face as she spotted the wild men who had come for them. She opened her mouth to scream. "Shut up!" He silenced her before she could give voice to her terror. Her mouth gaped open, and the whites of her eyes were huge. She looked at him as if he was mad, but he gave her no time to reply and forced his revolver into her hands. "Quick, take this." "What?" She screeched the word in the moment before he thrust over a small leather pouch. What do I do with this?" "Load it." I don't know how." Her voice was shrill. The panic that bubbled beneath the surface was rising up and threatening to escape. "Then beat the bastards to death with it." Jack snarled the words, his frustration building. He turned, spreading his legs wide as he balanced on the precarious roof. He risked a glance at the Gujars. The duck was still miles from the next caravanserai. He knew the robbers would not hang around. They would have picked their victims with care, timing their ambush so that the duck was alone and far from any other British travellers. He spat once, clearing his mouth of the sour taste of fear. He was not entirely without hope. The Gujars might be hard men, but they would not risk a pitched fight. The Grand Trunk Road was patrolled by soldiers from both the regular army and the ranks of the East India Company regiments. There was still a chance of rescue. If he could hold the bandits off long enough, a British cavalry patrol or a group of fellow travellers might appear in time to save them. The Gujars came on at a rush. The first man dodged past the pony still held in the duck's traces before clambering onto the driver's platform at the front of the carriage. He bounded to his feet, as agile as a mountain goat, before leaping up and launching himself at the duck's roof. The tulwar came for him before he could regain his balance. The steel keened as it cut through the overheated air, as if it was thirsting for blood after so long imprisoned in its scabbard. The edge was sharp, and the acrobatic Gujar bent double over the blade as it cut him down. Jack turned away even before the first man fell, ignoring the spray of blood flung wide by his fast-moving blade. Hands were grasping the sides of the roof, the Gujars seeking to haul themselves up by using the duck's window ledges as stepping stones. He could hear the feet scrabbling for purchase as they rushed to get to the pair of travellers whose wealth they sought to take as their own. He darted across the roof and stepped down hard, crushing the closest set of grasping fingers under the heel of his heavy army boot, before stamping left and right as more and more hands reached up. "Jack!" Armourer shouted his name. He crushed another set of fingers, then turned and charged across the roof. A Gujar had made it up and was reaching to take the young girl around the throat. There was time for Jack to see the grey in the man's beard and the spots of age on the hand that held a heavy lathi before he swept his tulwar forward, aiming to scythe the man from his feet. The duck was rocking back and forth as the band of Gujars threw themselves up the sides. He nearly lost his balance and staggered, only coming to a stop inches before he would have collided with Armourer. His blow went wide, but it had captured the attention of the old warrior, who pushed the girl away, sending her sprawling onto her back. The wooden lathi came at Jack in a practiced lunge, aimed at his gut. Jack roared as he saw the danger. He slashed his tulwar across his body, battering the Gujar's club to one side. As it went past, he stamped forward, recovering his sword from the parry and thrusting it into his opponent's stomach, twisting the steel hard as he drove it deep so that it was not trapped in the man's flesh. He felt cold as he began to fight, an unearthly calm descending over him. There was nothing of the rage that sustained him in the bitter, bloody depths of battle. Instead, he fought with dispassion, killing with detachment, his emotions scoured away. He tugged his sword back sharply, caring nothing for the man whose hands clutched the blade that had torn out his life. The tulwar sliced through the grasping fingers, the steel running with blood as Jack turned away, his only thought to find the next victim. "Jack, look out!" Armourer had pushed herself onto all fours, and now she shrieked out in warning. He turned in time to see a heavily bearded Gujar lurch across the roof. There was no time to bring his sword round. and Jack could do nothing as the man's lathe punched hard into his left side. The blow knocked him from his feet. Ignoring the sudden pain, he twisted his body the moment he hit the Dark's roof, then threw himself to one side as the club swung downwards, cutting through the air where his head had been a moment before. He scrabbled onto all fours, then grabbed the man around the ankle. He felt his fingers dig into sparse flesh as he took a firm hold before throwing his weight upwards, taking the man's leg with him. The fall was spectacular. The Gujar's leg went high, and the man crashed down onto his back, the breath driven from his body as his full weight slammed into the wooden roof. Jack scrambled back to his feet. He slashed his sword round in a vicious arc, driving away another 2 Gujars who had clambered onto the tiny battlefield, pushing them back, keeping them at bay for a moment longer. Then he reversed the blade, thinking to drive it down into the man he had toppled, feeling nothing as he prepared to extinguish another life. Amara got there first. She had crabbed across the roof, and now she smashed Jack's revolver down, driving the metal hilt into the turbaned head of their attacker. She cursed as she fought, punching the gun down again and again, her wild cry the last sound the robber would hear as she bludgeoned him to a bloody end. There was no time to dwell on the sight of his companion beating a man to death. More bandits had forced their way onto the roof, but they had learnt to be cautious of the beautiful blade that was being used with such pitiless professionalism, and they held off, hesitating and staying to the extremities of the limited space as they waited for another of their number to strike first. Jack did not wait to discover who that would be. With a feral roar, he threw himself forward. He moved fast, his boots dancing on the surface made treacherous by bright slicks of blood. He thrust the tulwar, aiming it at the belly of the closest enemy. At the last second, he twisted his wrist and slashed hard at a different man. The blade was moving quicker than the eye could track, and he bellowed in joy as the feint worked and his sword cut a thick crevice in his intended target's side. The Gujar he had first aimed at launched an attack of his own. His high-pitched squeal rang out, and Jack ducked low, seeing the movement of the man's lathe in the corner of his eye. The club whistled through the air as it whipped past over his head. The man's shriek was cut off as he saw his attack miss, but it quickly returned as Jack reached up and grabbed him around the throat. He felt the soft flesh under his fingers, and he dug them in deep before twisting his wrist hard and extending his arm, thrusting the Gujar back over the edge of the roof. The agonized scream was cut off abruptly as the man crashed into the rocky ground. Jack did not wait to hear it. He turned and thrashed his tulwar through the air, driving back the attackers who had climbed the opposite side of the duck and taken their first steps forward. Amara saw them back away from Jack's blade, and she scrambled to her feet, putting herself in their path. Teeth bared in defiance, she lashed out with the bloodied revolver, flailing it at the closest Gujar. The tribesman saw the wild swing and battered the attempted assault to one side with his lathe, baying in anger as he realized he was being attacked by a woman. Jack heard the notes of a trumpet sounding clear above the melee, but he paid it no heed and cut his sword at the Gujar who had deflected Amara's attack. He howled in frustration as the Gujar blocked the blow, the sharpened steel cutting a thick splinter from the heavy wooden lathe. He recovered the blade, but his foe was not hanging around to carry on the fight. The trumpet called for a second time, and the Gujar turned and jumped from the roof, his lathe thrown to one side in his haste to escape. Jack twisted on the spot, his tulwar held ready to fend off any attack coming at them from the other side of the roof. There was no one left to fight. The Gujars were running. The bright red of a horseman's tunic caught Jack's eye. The rider thundered past the maroon duck at the gallop. More men followed in tight formation. Their heavy sabres were drawn and they rode down the Gujars trying to flee. Jack twisted his head from side to side as the cavalry raced past. He recognized the red alkalaks and the mustard-coloured breeches immediately. They belonged to the 2nd Punjab Cavalry, an irregular regiment in the service of the East India Company. Leading the dark-faced riders forward was an English officer wearing a dark blue helmet wrapped in a navy pagdi and crowned with a brass spike. Around his waist, the hilt of a revolver poked from a tightly bound blue cummerbund, but the officer had no need of the handgun in the short, sharp struggle that was taking place around the stranded duck. As Jack stood and gasped for breath, the officer rose high in his stirrups to cut down the tribesmen who had been attacking Armourer. The rest of his Punjabi cavalrymen knew their business just as well, and the Gujars stood no chance. The company horsemen attacked with calm precision. The surviving bandits finished off in a brief flurry of hacking and cutting, the British horsemen employing their heavy sabres in a perfect demonstration of the drill they had practiced for hours for just such a moment as this. "I say, are you all right up there?" The plummy tones called up to where Jack and Armourer were standing on the roof of the Duck, trying to force scorching air into their struggling lungs. They looked at one another. Jack smiled first, then threw his head back and roared at the sky, laughing at the madness of what he had done. "Are you quite safe?" The voice called for a second time. An Armourer looked down into the concerned face of the British officer, who had brought his horse to a halt beside the stranded duck. With a visible shudder, she brought her emotions under control and called down to him. "Yes. Thank you." "My pleasure, ma'am." The young officer was clearly struck by Armourer's beauty, his cheeks flushed by more than just the exertion of riding to their rescue. Jack laughed at the polite display. He took Armourer's hand, holding it tight, wondering at her courage. She had stood at his side and fought for their lives. She had killed a man, yet now she blushed at the attention of an English subaltern. "Are you staring at me?" She saw she was the focus of his gaze. Jack glanced around him. The bodies of the men they had slain surrounded them, and they were perched precariously, the roof now slick with blood. Yet he could only look at her. "We had better get down." "That is a good and wise idea." Armourer made no attempt to move. Instead, she took his other hand. "You saved us." Jack shook his head in denial. "We saved us." Armourer offered a half-smile. "I could not let you do it all." "It is my job." He felt a single shiver slide down his spine. He might no longer wear the uniform of a British soldier, but in his heart he was a redcoat. Carefully he walked to the edge of the Dark's roof before crouching and bracing one leg on the window below him. He beckoned her to him, ready to help her down. She came willingly. He watched her pick her way through the debris, her movements lithe and controlled. She took his hand, then sat, sliding her legs over the edge. "You have saved me twice now." She paused as she sat close to him, her eyes fixed on his. "Thank you." "My pleasure, ma'am." Jack repeated the British officer's words. It earned him a look of reproof before Armourer lowered herself down. She glanced back at him when she was safely on the ground. He could not read her expression, something in the fleeting look quite beyond his appreciation. Then she turned away, her face hidden from him. He followed her down, his boots thumping heavily onto the dusty soil. He had fought for Armora and kept her safe. He knew he would do so again without hesitation. He had pledged himself to bring her safely to Delhi. He knew he did not really know her, but he did not care. His life had purpose again, and for now, that was enough. Chapter 6. Delhi, May 1857. The sight and smell of Delhi had accosted them when they were still over a mile from the city's walls. Jack felt little as the dark trundled noisily over the bridge of boats on the eastern approach. The journey had been too long for any excitement as their destination finally hove into view. An enormous fortress dominated the skyline. Even in the half-light of dusk, Jack could see the power of the impressive defences. He had learnt a little of the city's long history from Armora. The interminable hours of the journey had provided more hours of conversation than he cared to recall, but at least it had allowed her the time to give him some idea of the place that was drawing them in. The fabulous fortress was known as the Red Fort, the Lal Kila, and for 2 centuries it had been at the heart of the Mughal Emperor's domain. It had been built by the Emperor Shah Jahan when the Mughal Empire was at the height of its power. From behind its impregnable walls, the emperors had ruled their vast kingdom, governing the lives of the millions of subjects under their control. In those days, the empire had stretched from Bengal in the east to Baluchistan in the west, and from Kashmir in the north to the Kaveri Basin in the south, an enormous swathe of land that had made it one of the most powerful empires ever to have existed on the face of the earth. But, like so many great dynasties before them, the Mughals' powers had waned. Under pressure from without, and stricken with schism and dissatisfaction from within, their empire had crumbled. The Persian army under Nadir Shah was the first to attack, defeating the Mughal Emperor Muhammad Shah at the Battle of Karnal. The Marathas followed, turning raids and border skirmishes into complete domination. The subjugation of the Mughals completed swiftly and with little resistance. For 100 years the Marathas would rule the city of Delhi and control the Red Fort, the great power of the Mughals reduced to so much dust. It took the intervention of the British to finally defeat the Maratha forces. 50 years before Jack trundled peacefully into the city, General Gerard Lake's army overcame them at the Battle of Delhi. The Maratha territories were swiftly added to the dominion of the British East India Company, the commercial company that was allowed to govern the country in the name of the Queen. The British installed a political agent to rule the city and its lands before allowing the last of the Mughal emperors, Bahadur Shah, to take his place once more on the throne. Under the rule of the British resident, the once mighty Mughal Empire lived on in name alone, its ruler the puppet of his British overseers, his authority limited to the boundaries of the Red Fort itself. Even in the heart of his tiny domain, the British government controlled the emperor, his power now constrained by the same walls that had once protected his forebears. The Red Fort shielded the clique-ridden court from the city it ostensibly governed. It was oblong in shape, 100 yards long and 600 yards wide, and it nestled on the west bank of the Jumna River at the heart of the walled city of Delhi. The fort's walls were made of solid red sandstone and stood 20 yards high by the river, rising to 35 yards high where they abutted the city. Despite the perimeter being 1.5 miles long, there were just 2 main entrances to the Red Fort, the Delhi Gate to the south and the bigger Lahore Gate to the west, which also contained the apartments of Captain Douglas, the British commander of Bahadur Shah's bodyguard. Armora had told Jack that the Red Fort had once housed the fabled Peacock Throne. This fabulous object was a vivid demonstration of the vast wealth and immense power of the Mughal emperor. Made from solid gold, it sat in the Diwani Khas, or Hall of Private Audience, covered by a canopy surmounted with the 4 peacock figures that gave it its name, their vivid colours replicated by thousands of individual jewels. The victorious Nadir Shah of Persia had plundered the city and looted the priceless throne just over 100 years previously. Like the emperor's power, it had been stolen away, the pride and strength of the Mughals lost to another more powerful and ruthless empire. Now the Red Fort was little more than a den of iniquity, the court of the Mughal emperor a hotbed of scandal and intrigue. The denizens within its walls relished the minutiae of courtly life. Caring little that outside their gilded prison they were regarded as little more than an irrelevance, an anachronism of days now long gone. Jack looked up at the fort and wondered at the history it had witnessed. Armourer's tales had fired a desire to know more of the place he would likely live in for some weeks to come, the idea of immediately embarking on the return journey to Calcutta too awful to contemplate. He understood that the city had lived a hard life over the centuries. The notion made him shiver, a feeling of dread sliding slowly down his spine. He could not help but feel that he was coming to a place where the ghosts of the dead walked side by side with the living. Despite the splendour of the fortress's fabulous red walls, Jack sensed that Delhi was a city of the damned. The dark rumbled into the bustling city beneath the high walls of the Lal Kila. The houses around them were little more than mud and thatch, the same mean peasant hovels that Jack had seen in the native quarter of Calcutta. The streets were narrow, the labyrinth of drab houses crowded together, each pressed hard into the flank of its neighbour, the lives they contained spilling out onto the narrow paths that led through the maze. "Are we there?" A sleepy voice interrupted his scrutiny of the city he had killed men to reach. He stretched across and took hold of Armourer's hand. She lifted her head, her face coming alive as she realized that they had arrived. She leant forward, her free hand pressing down onto Jack's thigh as she pushed her head to the dark's window. She said nothing as she drank in the sight and smell of her home. Her eyes darted back and forth, trying to look at everything at once, the familiar sights filling her face with joy. "I am home." She pulled back sharply and beamed at Jack, then thrust her head through the opposite window, her breathless laughter infectious. "I am home." She twisted round, planting a firm kiss on Jack's cheek before turning back once again to bury herself in the sensation of having returned to where she belonged. Jack watched her closely. Her delight was obvious, and it made him jealous. He could not imagine ever feeling the same emotion. To him there was nowhere that meant even a fraction of the feeling he saw in Armourer. He pictured the dank, grimy rookeries of his youth. There would be little pleasure in returning to their cloying embrace. Armourer called out instructions to the Duck's crew, who had toiled for so long to bring her back to the place of her birth. They had returned in the aftermath of the Gujar ambush, shamefaced and wringing their hands in angst whilst wailing their sorrow aloud. After several minutes of their raucous display, Jack had been content to allow them back, if only to put an end to the caterwauling. The Duck rumbled to a halt, the wheels screeching one last time. Jack got out quickly and stood back as the driver's assistants stripped the carriage of their possessions, working fast to send their passengers on their way through the narrow, busy streets that led to Armourer's home. Armourer chivied them along, her voice sniping constantly as she directed them about their task. She was like a sparrow, darting this way and that, her tiny frame lost amidst the finely muscled bodies of the local porters who had swarmed around the Dark the moment it had stopped. It took several long minutes to get everything organised to her satisfaction. When she returned to Jack's side, 6 porters formed an orderly queue behind her, festooned with the belongings she had acquired in the long weeks of the journey. Jack ran his eyes over the small group, making sure that his single knapsack had not been forgotten in the melee. His tulwar was buckled to his side, the weapon incongruous against his civilian garb, but he refused to let the blade out of his sight. His loaded revolver hung at his hip. He might be in his companion's hometown, but he was prepared for anything. "Are you ready, Jack? Or are you planning on standing there all night?" Amara slid her hands around his arm. She pressed close to his body, and he felt the curve of her flesh warm against him. For the first time he remembered fondly the cramped confines of the dark. "Come, come!" She pulled him forward, her excitement reflected in the glow of the fires and torches that lit their way. He let himself be led, but kept his right hand hovering over the revolver on his hip. He'd unbuckled the flap on the holster as he waited for them to be ready. The feeling of dread that he had felt on entering the city had refused to disappear. She guided him into the narrow streets off Chandni Chowk, the great marketplace that stretched from the gates of the Red Fort into the heart of the walled city. The sun was setting, and the place was busy as the churches, mosques, and temples filled for evening worship. The air was full of ringing bells, the Christian churches of Delhi as noisy as those in any English town on a Sunday morning. He could even hear the thumping chords coming from the organ in St. James's as the large British community began their evening service. The British residents of Delhi lived a life far removed from that of the local population, who had become accustomed to the white-faced foreigners in their midst. After an enormous dinner late in the afternoon, the British would rumble out of the civil lines in their fine carriages, passing through the bottleneck of the Kashmir Gate for their evening drive, or heading for the spectacular church in the city's centre. Thousands of miles from home, they had succeeded in establishing for themselves a civilised and very British existence. They were quite content to ignore the fact that they lived cheek by jowl with a population that possessed a culture and a way of life wholly foreign to their own. The two vastly different worlds lived side by side, neither paying any attention to the other, the line dividing them as deep as any chasm between mountain ranges. The bells of the Christian churches faded into the background as Jack followed Amara deeper into the city. Loud voices called out from the minarets that jutted into the sky. The wailing call echoed around the city, summoning the faithful to prayer, the long melodic chant wavering as it rushed through the streets. To Jack's ear the cry sounded unearthly, the strange words and sounds wholly foreign to him. It was another reminder of the gulf that existed between the English and the people they ruled. They moved on, through some more narrow streets where handbells chimed and the hawkers and stallholders tried to work the fast-moving crowds that surged past now that the time for worship had arrived. Underscoring everything was the sound of voices as thousands of people talked as one. Entire families disgorged from their houses and headed out for the evening. Their cries and conversations created a vibrant undertone as they bustled past on their way to church or the local mosque. Jack followed Amara through the crowds. It was the thing about India that he had most struggled to become accustomed to. The vast multitude of people overwhelmed him, a great swarm of humanity that outnumbered their white masters by thousands to one. He had thought of himself as being a charlatan, but his exploits were as nothing when compared with the great trick of the British Empire. For here, in Britain's most vibrant colony, existed the biggest deception of them all. In India, the many were controlled by the few, and God forbid the many should ever unite to expel their foreign rulers. He turned and looked over his shoulder. He knew he was gawping like a griffin, but he could not resist. He was fascinated by everything he saw. The life of the city was infectious. There was excitement in the bustle and hubbub, and it tantalized him as he studied it from within, inside it yet not apart. As ever, he was the stranger, the Farangi, the one who did not belong. The great red fort glowed in the last light of the day. Torches were being lit along its walls, and deep inside the palace he could see the bouncing lights of a procession of bearers as some of its hidden denizens embarked on their own march to worship. He cocked an ear and heard the sound of distant music, the repetitive clanging of the church bells sounding discordant against the echoes of tabors, trumpets, and pipes. Their progress slowed. Armour turned and smiled in reassurance as they picked their way through the growing horde. Their small party pushed past a group of Gujar herdsmen, their fierce glares standing in perfect contrast to the wide-eyed boys from the Mofusal who walked in the other direction, gawping and staring at the vibrant life packed into the crowded streets. Jat farmers bellowed and spat as they strode through the melee, their curses following the faster-moving students from Delhi College, who whooped and yelled as they jostled their way through the crowd with youthful exuberance. Jack gave up any attempt at nonchalance and let his eyes roam as they passed into a wider street, the crowds thinning enough to let him turn his head more freely. He smiled as he saw a few unfortunate gamblers locked in a line of public stocks, their fellows catcalling and teasing as they headed to the bustling Sufi shrines to ask to be blessed for good luck. Gentlemen from Lucknow in their distinctive wide-bottomed pyjamas glided past, their wealth affording them smoother passage through the riotous streets, their servants clearing their path with loud, hectoring voices and quick hands. The party moved on, passing a group of tall, bearded Pathan horse traders from Peshawar and Ambala standing in a corner of the street, their hard eyes roving the crowd, ever watchful for danger and assessing every man as a potential enemy. Their hands were never far from the enormous tulwars on their hips, and Jack dropped his eyes as they came close, inspecting the weapons that were so very similar to his own. "Come, Jack." Amra danced in front of him, turning this way and that, her face alive with infectious excitement. They passed Gantawalla's, the famous sweet shop, which was packed out with a dense, surging crowd waiting with growing impatience to taste its famous offerings. Kawakana lined the streets near the shop, and Jack felt the surreptitious scrutiny of 100 stares as dark-eyed men sipped tea or pressed their mouths to the hookah. Others gazed at him without shame, chewing furiously on beetle or bang, their eyes full of distrust for the Farangi who was in the wrong part of town. Jack followed Amara into an open square, and a fresh wave of noise assailed him, louder even than the wild hubbub of the narrow side streets. In the large, open space, poets stood on small plinths or overturned crates, their voices raised as they recited their verses, each drawing a crowd of rapt onlookers who stared and smiled as they were taken on a journey through the words of the performers. More voices were raised as groups of scholars engaged in debate, the animated discourse building as each tried to sway the other with the fierce passion of their argument. Jack's head turned on instinct as a waft of subtle perfume caught in his throat. A parade of courtesans sauntered past, their lithe bodies painted and decorated in dozens of fabulous colours. The doe-eyed beauties smiled and laughed as the crowds parted before them, the power of their taut flesh matching that of Moses. He could not help but stare in fascination as they came past, the flimsy silks leaving little to the imagination. A sharp tug on his hand forced him to look away, and he saw the wide smile on Amara's face as she caught him ogling. There was no rebuke in her eyes, just pleasure. Her mouth opened as she laughed, but the sound was lost in the din around them. She led him on through the bustling throng, the porters still following willingly in their wake, the promise of payment enough to secure their loyalty. They headed towards a narrow side street on the far side of the square, passing by a group of half-naked labourers. Their eyes cast down in exhaustion, not even the sight of a Farangi enough to stir them from their rest. A storyteller sat on a simple wooden stool close to the entrance to the street Armourer was leading them towards, and for the first time she paused, her desire to get home stalled by the quiet words of the tiny, wizened old man. She turned, pulling Jack close, hugging his arm to her chest as she slowed their progress so that she could hear the man speak. Jack listened to the pattern of the storyteller's words. He could not understand what it was he heard, but there was something mesmerizing in the rhythm of the sounds. The old man held his audience rapt, his quiet, assured delivery more effective than the wild bellows and shouts of the debates going on nearby. Jack smiled as the crowd reacted. The gasps and sharp intakes of breath followed by knowing grunts or short bursts of laughter as the storyteller took them on a familiar journey. Armourer pressed close, lifting her mouth to Jack's ear. I remember this man from when I was a little girl. I would listen to him all day. Jack felt the warmth of her breath on his skin, the gentle tease of her lips on the soft flesh of his ear. He pulled her close, breathing in the sensation of her body so close to his, the feel of her hip under his hand, the gossamer-like touch of her hair whispering on his neck. He is telling the Dastan-i Amir Hamza. The foreign words echoed in his head as she spoke. His senses were overloaded, and he closed his eyes, focusing on the girl in his arms, trying to tether himself to her lest he be lost in the wild spectacle surging around him. It is an epic romance, a tale of lovers. Armourer suddenly pulled away. Her eyes never left Jack's, her mouth curling into a teasing smile as she tugged him forward once more. They turned into the side street. It was much less crowded, the houses of a better quality than the ones he had seen earlier. Each of the tall kothis boasted a grand wooden balcony hidden behind a screen of intricate latticework. At the end of the street, the gates of the mahalla were being locked for the night, securing the residents against the interference of outsiders from the other quarters of the city. He looked up and saw lights and movement behind the lattice screens on the upper floors of the closest kothi. He heard the sound of singing, the lilt of foreign voices rising above the hubbub they had left behind. Armourer came to a halt close to the end of the street. She seemed suddenly unsure, as if she could not quite believe where she was. Jack said nothing. He let go of her hand and let her stalk forward, her small steps taking her away from him and into the opening that led to the tall townhouse. He stood and waited, patient now that the long journey was complete. He heard a wild cry of delight, the rapture of the return of the prodigal daughter. He smiled, content that Armourer had found what she had been seeking. Yet it reminded him that he was still alone. Chapter 7. Jack felt the prickle of rising heat as soon as he stepped out onto the balcony. It was still early, the sun yet to fully rise, but already the temperature was building. In the British cantonment outside the city, it would be a day for cold baths and lying in darkened rooms, the windows sealed off with woven wicker screens soaked in water in a futile attempt to chill the scorching air. It would be a day to endure, to survive the suffocating heat until the cooler air of evening made life bearable once again. Jack smiled as he thought of the many techniques he had seen the British employ to survive the ferocious climate and carry on as if they lived in the quiet peace of the English countryside. He recalled the rose gardens around the bungalows in the British cantonment outside the city of Sawad. He remembered the delicate perfume hanging in the air and the splashes of vibrant colour that had stood out so prettily against the whitewashed walls. He shook his head as he recalled the waste. For the pleasing aesthetic was only made possible by a convoluted system of irrigation channels and ox-powered pumps, the efforts of 24 servants exhausted in a conceited attempt to produce no more than a few dozen stubby bushes. The British population spread across the great Mefusel fought a constant battle against their surroundings. Cockroaches, lizards, red ants, and swarms of flying insects united to drive them to distraction. Wine glasses could not be left outside without silver coasters across their tops to prevent a multitude of insects drowning themselves. At dinner, saucers of water had to be placed beneath the legs of tables and chairs to prevent a legion of ants scurrying up and into the laps of the horrified diners, and no elegant soiree was complete without a dozen or more servants standing behind their guests, their horse-tail swats battling to keep away the more determined of the bloodthirsty insect horde, desperate to feast on the sweaty white flesh. That morning, Jack had been awoken by the noise of the gongs ringing in the Jama Masjid an hour before sunrise. Armourer had told him that it was the 16th day of Ramadan, and no Muslim could eat or drink from sunrise to sunset. Families rose early, sitting outside in the cooler air to eat their pre-fast meal of sweet seviyan, and for those with the stomach for it, chicken kebabs and bread. It was cool enough in the shade for Jack to bear being outside, and he stood enjoying the relative peace. He had not slept well, the comfort of the charpoy too much after so many nights spent either in the dak or in a caravanserai, and he had slept alone. He had heard the soft murmur of voices through the night as Armourer and her mother eased the pain of months of separation and constant conversation. Jack had gathered that Armourer's Irish father had deserted them when she was no more than 6 years old, answering the call of the drum when his regiment was recalled to England. Abandoning his new family as he returned to the wife and the children he had left behind. Years later, there had been no one to protect Armourer when the men came for her, her small family powerless against the local dacoits who sold young girls to the men in the distant cities with the need for pretty and youthful flesh. Jack started as he heard a cannon fire. He looked around and saw a smudge of dark grey smoke spreading out from one of the bastions on the walls of the Red Fort. The single shot marked the arrival of sunrise, the first smudge of light pushing through the murk on the far horizon to greet the start of another day. It marked the commencement of the day's fast, the Muslims in the city forced into abstinence for the next dozen hours. Armourer arrived silently at his side. He only noticed her presence when she slipped an arm around his waist. He looked down and saw the dark smudges around her eyes. The grey puffiness of a night passed without sleep. Yet she wore a contented smile, and he forced away the spark of jealousy that he felt at seeing her delight at being home. "Thank you." "For what?" They both spoke in the hushed tone of dawn, the quiet voices of those trying hard not to disturb any in the household still sleeping. "For bringing me home." "It was my pleasure." Armourer wrapped her arms around his waist and nestled her head against his chest. She didn't speak for some time. When she did, her voice was small. "You fought for me." She looked up at his face. "You killed for me." Jack said nothing. He felt the chill hand of death send a single shudder running down his spine. "You frightened me then." She was speaking faster now. "You killed those robbers like you were plucking chickens, like it meant nothing." "It didn't." His voice was cold as he gave the lie, doing his best to ignore the ghosts her words had summoned. Armora didn't look away. She saw Jack's eyes focus as if he were looking at an object 1,000 yards distant. She had seen the same look before, and she knew he was lost in another world. She pulled him close, pressing her body to his, hoping that the warmth of her flesh would bring him back to her. They stood together in silence and watched the sun rise. "What's that?" Jack put down the cloth he'd been using to clean his revolver and pointed to the thin column of smoke rising from a street not more than 400 yards from where they sat. The balcony was cool. The canopy above their heads sheltered them from the scorching power of the relentless sun that was still many hours away from its zenith. They were 3 floors up, high enough to see out over the rooftops of the houses behind Armora's family's Kothi, whilst enjoying the fresh breeze that blew over the city from the direction of the Jumna River. "It is coming from Daryaginj." Armora sounded weary. She had been dozing, a sleepless night leaving her without the energy to do anything but sit and rest. Jack was bored. He wanted to know more of the city he had journeyed so far to find. "What's that when it's at home?" Armora sighed. "It is the smallest mahalla in the city. You cannot trust the beggars who come from there. They are cheats, liars, swindlers." "They sound like my kind of people." He got to his feet, walking to the edge of the balcony so that he could peer through the lattice to study the column of smoke that was building steadily. "What are they burning? Isn't it hot enough already?" "They are fools in Daryaginj. Anything is possible." Jack was in no mood to sit and idle the day away. He disappeared back into the house for several minutes before emerging back outside with his field glasses. The brass felt wonderfully cool against his forehead as he brought the glasses to his eyes and panned slowly over the city. All seemed calm. He followed the antics of a pair of tiny kite-hawks that turned and wheeled on the breeze, swooping and diving as they hunted over the rooftops. They fascinated him, and he tracked them as they raced away, heading towards the Jumna River, which skirted the eastern edge of the city. A sudden commotion caught his attention, and he focused the glasses on the streets that ran down to the Jumna. The river drew in early morning bathers by the hundred, but instead of the sight of people enjoying their ablutions, he saw panic. The streets were full of men, women, and children running, heading away from the river and flooding back into the city. He felt the first stirring of unease. He looked in every direction, trying to see what could have caused such a commotion. He found nothing. A part of him wanted to ignore it. The heat had started to build down onto the top of his skull, and it was tempting to retreat into the shade and pay no attention to the little tick of fear that had started deep in his gut. "Jack, either sit down or go for a walk." Armora delivered the admonishment with a smile. "I think I'll go out for a while," he replied in an even tone, hiding his anxiety. He was rewarded with nothing more substantial than a languid flick of her hand. He shook his head and left her to stew in the heat, only pausing long enough to pick up his revolver and its pouch of ammunition. He would go for a walk and see if he could lose the whisper of danger that was murmuring in his ear. Jack walked along the empty street. Even his limited experience of the city told him it had to be rare for no one to be around, and the lack of people worried him. A man scurried quickly across the end of the narrow street. Jack walked towards him, only to stop when the man turned. He saw the look of suspicion on the thin face. It was the same look he had seen on the faces of the men in the tea houses the previous evening, the flat stare and narrowed eyes as they spied the Farangi far from where he should be. The man hurried away, leaving Jack alone once again. His instincts were fully alert now. He listened carefully. Far in the distance he heard a sound he recognized at once, one that he had heard too many times before not to be certain of its origin. It was the sound of gunfire, of muskets being discharged. He stopped in his tracks and sat down on the step of the nearest house. It would take several minutes, but his sense of danger refused to disappear, and he would not take another step without his revolver sitting loaded, primed, and ready in its holster. As he sat and began carefully but quickly to go through the ritual of loading the 5-shot revolver, he smelt the bitter tang of smoke. Either the smoke from the fires in Daryaginj was drifting his way, or something closer was burning. His unease flared. Whichever it was, it could only be a sign of trouble. He loaded the 5 chambers with deft fingers, pouring powder into each one as carefully as he could before ramming a ball home. He kept looking up, scanning the street for the danger that he was sure was close. When all 5 chambers were loaded, he sealed each with a dab of grease that he kept in a small glass jar for the purpose. It would prevent a misfire, or worse still, a flash fire that would see more than one charge ignited by a single spark and render the gun useless. He had learnt to be careful, to do everything he could to make sure the weapon did not let him down. The thin-faced man reappeared. His kurta was stained, and the pagdi wrapped around his head was frayed and tatty. Jack recognized him as one of the city ruffians, a badmush who would cut your pocket or your throat without a moment's hesitation. He snapped his revolver shut and thrust the weapon into the holster on his right hip. He left the flap unbuckled. He heard shouting and got to his feet, keen to find out if he was right to be uneasy, or if his instinct was playing him false. He had no intention of skulking in the shadows, and was determined to discover an explanation for the strange events he had seen through his field glasses. The rest of the Kothi was still and silent. He saw vague signs of life, the shadows of people moving behind the latticework screens, yet no one ventured out to join him in the street. He heard the sound of a horse's hooves and forced himself into a run. He was dressed only in a white cotton shirt and loose trousers, but he felt the sweat begin to run freely over his body. The street was shaded by the tall townhouses, so it was only as he burst out into the open square at its end that he felt the full force of the sun blast into his skull. He saw a troop of native cavalry riding past on the opposite side of the square. They wore the silver-grey tunics of the 3rd Bengal Light Cavalry. The sight made the breath catch in his throat. The Bengal Lights were not a regiment he knew well, but he had fought with the 3rd Bombay Light Cavalry in the recent campaign against the Shah of Persia. The sight of the dark-faced native troopers was so familiar that the feeling of dread that had dogged him since he had first spotted the panicked flight of the city's bathers disappeared in a single heartbeat. He raised his hand, his first thought to wave and call out to the British officer he expected to see leading what looked to be a single troop. The gesture stopped before it was more than half-formed. He scanned the ranks of Sawars again, but there was no white officer present. He screwed his eyes against the glare of the sun. Something was wrong. He took in the unkempt appearance of the troopers, the unbuttoned jackets and open, stockless collars, the mix of drawn and sheathed sabres, the lack of correct spacing in the ranks. No officer would allow his men into the city in such a condition. Jack eased himself back into the shadows, his instincts once again singing out in danger. The sound of a commotion erupted from the far corner of the square. A fine black buggy tore out of a side street, the grey-bearded driver whipping his pair of ponies hard. Even from a distance, Jack could hear the man roaring in terror, his panicked shouts urging the animals to greater speed. He was driving as if the very hounds of hell were after him. The sawars of the 3rd Bengal Light Cavalry saw the buggy and immediately spurred after it. Their loud catcalls and whoops reached Jack as he pressed himself against the cold stone of the nearest house, the coolness of the shadows doing nothing to dampen his fear. The horsemen rode fast, jostling one another as they chased after their quarry, their horses snorting with excitement as their riders spurred them on. A large crowd charged into the square in the wake of the galloping buggy. Jack heard their yells, the angry roar of the mob. He saw the mismatched array of swords, clubs, and axes raised above their heads as they bayed for blood. At first he couldn't understand what they were saying, the feral screams unintelligible. Then he caught a single phrase shouted over and over as they chased the terrified driver of the buggy. He had no idea what could have happened, what could have sparked the wild behaviour he was witnessing. But one thing was now obvious. Delhi was no longer a safe place for an Englishman and his half-caste companion. It was time to run. Chapter 8. Jack turned and ran. He heard the triumphant roar as the sawars of the Bengal Lights caught up with the fleeing buggy. He heard the first scream. The sound rose to a crescendo before it was cut off abruptly, the cheer that followed leaving him in no doubt what had happened to the grey-bearded fellow who had tried so hard to escape the mob. The thin-faced man he had seen earlier jumped out into his path. Jack had no time to change direction, and could do nothing to resist as he felt himself grabbed around the shoulders. The back street ruffian might have been slight, but there was strength in his wiry frame, and Jack was thrown hard to one side and pinned to the wall of the nearest kothi. Flecks of spit splattered against his face as the cutthroat bellowed his success, his mouth open wide in delight. Jack squirmed in the man's grip, twisting this way and that as he tried to escape. Try as he might, he couldn't break free. He saw every detail of the man's sallow skin and the threadbare scraggy beard that surrounded the fetid mouth with its handful of ragged brown teeth. The man's thin hands grasped his arms with fingers like claws, and his jagged fingernails dug painfully into his flesh. Jack's anger built swiftly. He knew what would happen if the mob in the square heard his assailants' triumphant shouts. He would be torn to pieces, his precious revolver no defence against such a horde. With his arms pinioned, there was nothing else for it. He closed his eyes, gritting his teeth against the inevitable pain, before smashing his head forward, driving it into the centre of the badmash's face. The impact was brutal. Jack felt the warm splatter of blood across his face, the crunch of teeth splintering under the force of the blow. The thin-faced man staggered backwards, his wild cry silenced. Still he gripped Jack's arms, his fingers clinging on even as his face was pulped. Jack spat once and drove his head forward again, ignoring the pain that flared in bright white agony, as if a red-hot poker had been driven through the centre of his skull. The second blow landed square on the man's nose. This time the badmash fell away, his hands rising to cradle his face as he crumpled to the ground. Jack had no thought of mercy. Even as the man writhed on the ground, he lifted his leg high, then drove the heel of his heavy boot into the blood-smeared hands. The man went still, and Jack made to move away, but his vision blurred and the world turned grey. He shook his head, cursing at the pain. For a moment he thought he would fall, and he was forced to lean on the wall he had been pinned against, holding onto it for support. Slowly his vision cleared, the worst of the pain fading, and he forced himself into a trot. He did not glance back at the man who had thought to capture him. He heard another smattering of gunfire, the cough of muskets easily recognisable to someone who had led the attack against the Russian redoubt at the Alma. It was the sound of battle, the noise of men fighting. It did not belong in the centre of a peaceful city, and he felt a tight knot of fear tie itself deep in his gut. He raced down the familiar side street where Amira's mother lived, coughing away the blood that coated his face. When he reached the house, he careered up the stairs, his boots skidding on the stone steps. The blood caked to his heel, nearly sending him sprawling. He burst onto the balcony to the rear of the house to find Amira fast asleep. "Amira, get up! Quick! We're leaving!" He reached across and shook her awake, careless of hurting her, the urgency of the moment overriding any thought of being gentle. He waited long enough to see her eyes open and focus before he bounded away, his thoughts turning to grabbing his knapsack and his tulwar. "Jack?" Her voice cracked as she struggled awake. "Jack? What is it?" "Grab anything you want to take. We have to leave." He stuck his head back outside. "Right now." "Why?" She came to her feet. "What has happened?" "I don't know," he shouted from inside. "The place has gone mad." Amira staggered to the lattice fretwork that screened the balcony. She peered out. It took only a quick look at the columns of smoke dotted across the rooftops for her to recognise that she was not being misled. I don't understand. What can have happened?" "It's a riot or a mutiny, I don't know." Jack came back out to the balcony. His knapsack sat squarely on his shoulders, and he was doing up the last of the buckles on the belt that would hold his tulwar around his waist. He grabbed Amira by the arms and pulled her close so that his face was inches from hers. "But whatever it is, it's not good for us. We have to leave, and we have to do it now." Jack was certain Amira was in as much danger as he was. Her neighbours would know of her parenthood, and her pale skin would mark her out as a half-caste. They would have seen the Farangi officer who had brought her home. It might not be enough to condemn her, but he would not take the chance. Amira nodded, slowly comprehending that something truly dreadful was happening. Her face fell. "My mother." "Where is she?" "She went to bathe in the river. She's out there somewhere." She turned to look outside, her face creased in concern. Flames were beginning to leap in the sky above Daryaganj. Great columns of smoke swirled and twisted across the rooftops, their bitter, acrid smell smothering the city. "Then there is nothing we can do." Jack's words cut through her distress. "She knows the city. She'll find somewhere safe. We must do the same." Amira rallied fast. Jack nodded in appreciation. Where some young women would have railed against him, Amira simply understood. She pushed past Jack, heading quickly indoors. Jack walked to the lattice screen and scanned the skyline. Flames and smoke could be seen in nearly every direction. He looked down into the street behind Amira's family home. The shopkeepers there were rushing to board up their premises, desperate to protect their goods from the madness that had taken hold of the city. "I am ready," Amira called from inside. She had wrapped herself in a bright, multicoloured shawl and rammed a wide-awake straw hat on her head. Jack stepped towards her. "What's the quickest way out of here? Out of the city?" Amira understood at once. "The Rajghat Gate. 5, maybe 10 minutes walk." "Right. That's where we're going. God knows what is happening, but I want to get us as far away as possible. We're not going to stop for anything, no matter what we see. This isn't my fight. My only concern is getting you out of here." He saw the understanding in her eyes. There was nothing more to be said. He checked his holster was unbuckled and that his tulwar was loose in its leather scabbard. Then he reached forward and took Amira by the hand. He fixed her with a thin, grim smile. "Let's go." "Ma Farangi ko!" The call accosted them before they had gone more than 100 yards from the house. Jack didn't wait to see where it had come from. He kept his head down, increasing the length of his stride as he led Armour in the opposite direction to the square where he had seen the grey-bearded buggy driver being chased. "Ma Farangi, go!" The shout came again. This time it was followed by the sound of running feet. Jack pulled Armour hard as they changed direction, darting down the nearest alley. It took them away from where she had said they needed to go, but it could not be helped. They would have to double round and try another path. "What the fuck does that mean?" Jack had recognized the phrase. He'd heard the mob yelling it as they chased down the man in the buggy. Jack hissed the question through gritted teeth. His breath was already coming in tortured gasps as he tried to force the suffocating air into his lungs. It was like trying to breathe in an oven, the air scalding his throat as he sucked it down. "Kill the foreigner," Armour panted the reply. She had her skirts bunched in her free hand as she raced after him. The arm he held was fully extended as she struggled to keep up with his fast pace. "Shit." Jack spat out the single word. He had no breath for any more questions. They skidded around another corner and ran on, pounding through the back streets. Their luck was holding, but he knew it could not last. Still, he led them on, galloping down the next street and then the next, dragging Armour after him, moving as quickly as he dared. They careered to a halt at a junction where 4 streets came together. Jack dropped her hand and twisted round in a frustrated circle. "Which way now?" He snapped the question, his breath ragged. "You idiot!" The words came out in between the gasps as she tried to regain her own breath. "I thought you knew where we were going." "How the hell would I know that?" Jack spoke in little more than a sob. "Well, you were leading." Armour walked in a tight circle, her hands on her hip. "I thought that meant you knew where to go." "I've never been here before." "Then why lead?" Armour's breathing was slowly returning to normal. She was recovering faster than Jack, who was forced to bend double, his hands pressed to his knees as he struggled to breathe. She strode forward. A quick glance at the choice of streets confirmed in her mind where they were. She turned back, waiting for Jack to recover. "Ready now?" Jack forced his abused body to stand straight. The centre of his forehead throbbed, the legacy of the double headbutt, but he could recover later, when they were safe. He nodded, and Armour reached forward and took his hand. "Then follow me, you fool." She pulled him hard, leading with confidence. His lungs burned and his shaking legs felt certain to give way, but he could do nothing save follow her as best he could, amazed at the speed and ease with which she covered the ground. They rushed around a corner, then another, moving too fast to know if they were running to safety or hurtling towards a violent collision with the mob. They ran hard, pounding through the empty streets, every aching stride taking them closer to the nearest gate and the chance to escape the madness that had taken hold of Delhi. A crowd of people appeared at the end of the street they were galloping along. It took no more than a single second for the closest figures to spot the Englishman and his companion before the voices screamed in anger and the mob surged towards them, an array of weapons ready to taste Farangi blood. Jack did not hesitate. He pulled Armour backwards, turning her around so they could run back the way they had come. He heard a moan come from the mob as their quarry turned and fled. He heard nothing more as he ran, his ears filled with the roar of his own breath. A brick smashed into the ground close to his boots as the mobs released its frustration at their sudden flight. They turned a corner and nearly ran into the back of a second crowd. Jack skidded to an abrupt halt. This mob was mainly made up of men wearing dirty kurtas and stained dhotis. They stood in a circle, their attention focused on something hidden in their midst. Their voices bellowed in unison. It was a visceral cry, a deep, pounding chant, The same word shouted over and over to create a primeval sound that set every nerve in his body on edge. Maro, Maro. He heard Armourer cry out in horror as she saw what was attracting such vile attention. Through a gap in the ring of men, he spotted what looked like a pile of abandoned clothes lying on the ground. He turned away, taking Armourer with him, his thoughts focused only on their escape. The mob had not seen them. They were lost in frenzy, the bundle of clothing the target for their rage. The men closest to it lashed out, smashing cudgels, lathes, even a broken table leg into it. Behind them the crowd screamed in twisted ecstasy as they watched the weapons smash down time after time into the pathetic huddle at their feet. Jack was pulling at Armourer, but she fought back, screaming in incoherent rage, twisting him back around so that he faced the wild crowd once more. That was when he saw it. Nothing he had ever witnessed had prepared him for that moment. He felt the gorge rise in his throat, the sheer, desperate horror sending a shudder of revulsion surging through him. The face of a young, white woman was looking towards him. It was streaked with blood, barely a patch of pale skin left uncovered. The woman was dead, but her blue eyes stared straight at Jack. They stayed locked on him even as her head rocked from side to side as the mob continued to beat at her ruined flesh, their rage not satiated by her brutal death. The silent accusation in those eyes taunted him, demanding that he act. Blood flew high as the lathes thumped down again and again, the wooden clubs coming away smothered with gore. Still the crowd bayed, screaming in hatred. As more blows rained down, the dead woman was thrown onto her back, revealing the final horror. She had been trying to shelter her daughter, but now the tiny body was revealed. Her efforts had been in vain. The child was dead. Jack stared in shock as he saw a heavy lathe thump into the little girl's tender flesh. The same repulsive chant doubled in volume as the mob found a fresh target for their rage. Dozens of clubs smashed down as one. The men wielding them, baring their teeth as they strained to batter the tiny body into oblivion, the crowd screaming in perverse delight. Jack tugged his revolver free, his hands shaking with rage. He was moving without thought, the strength of feeling like nothing he'd ever experienced, even in the darkest moments of battle. The tulwar flashed as he drew it, the naked steel rasping as it left the leather scabbard. "Jack!" Armourer screamed his name, her voice distorted by sobs. He heard nothing. He opened fire as he stalked forwards. The crash of the handgun was loud in the confined space of the narrow street. The first heavy bullet punched the closest man from his feet, the spinning ball tearing through his neck in a shower of blood. Jack controlled the recoil and brought the gun down once more. He continued to walk forward, his pace steady. He fired again, and then again, each bullet killing one of the hateful mob who belatedly turned to face him, those at the front suddenly aware of the vengeful killer pacing towards them. The awful chant died away, the voices stilled as Jack's fourth and fifth bullets tore into the crowd. All found targets, killing first a man and then a woman who had been screaming in bloodlust as she helped batter the mother and her child to death. The revolver was empty, and Jack let it fall from his hand. He started to run, crying out as he increased his speed, his revulsion released. He charged, the tulwar braced and ready to kill. The mob fled. In their haste, they scrambled at one another, their hatred lost in a flood of terror at the lone Farangi who had appeared to exact revenge. Jack tore into them. His tulwar slashed forward, cutting through the turbaned head of the nearest. The man fell, and he leapt over the lifeless corpse, already flaying his sword at another. The blade sang as it stung the air before thumping into the man's side, the twite swirling script along its length lost beneath a sudden torrent of blood. He pulled the blade away and threw himself into the heart of the fleeing mob. His mind was lost. An all-consuming rage seared through his veins. He went wild, flailing and hacking with his sword, shrieking as he killed and killed. More men fell to his blade, the fast-moving steel slicing through flesh, the weapon used without thought of mercy. A man with flecks of grey in his beard turned and battered his bloody lathie back at Jack. It was a desperate attempt, the desire to escape giving the murderer enough courage to face the Farangi. Jack's tulwar swatted aside the man's blow as if it were nothing. A single heartbeat later, and the man's throat was gone, snatched away by the lightning-quick blade. Jack stepped on corpses, thinking of nothing but the next victim for his sword. There were none. He had exacted a dreadful revenge. The crowd that had killed the woman and her child were all dead. He stood in a puddle of their blood, the bodies of his victims carpeting the ground around him. He turned, his emotions still running wild, his own blood hammering in his ears so he could hear nothing save the roar of his heart. He wanted to kill again. Armourer had fallen to her knees beside the victims of the crowd's dreadful attack. Her skirts were soaked with blood as she cradled the child's head in her lap, but she seemed not to notice. She was rocking back and forth, as if singing peaceful lullabies to soothe the little girl to her rest. Jack's madness left him. He shuddered, his whole body shaking with the horror of the moment. With slow, deliberate steps he walked towards Armourer, his heart clenched with disgust at what had happened. Armourer got slowly to her feet, laying the child gently back on the ground. Jack felt tears running down his face, cutting a path through the blood of his enemies that had splattered across him as he fought. He heard the roar of the mob that had been chasing them. They could not be far away, and he turned towards them, the battle rage starting to course through him once again. "Jack, no!" Armourer came to his side and grabbed his arm. She pulled him back, but he was stronger, and he shook off her hands and stalked forward. All he wanted to do was fight, to take his tulwar and kill the soulless beings who could bellow with joy at the sight of a dead child. "Jack!" Armourer leapt at him, sobbing as she used all her strength to twist him round. He saw her distress and stopped. As he turned to face her, he caught sight of the child. Her blonde hair was sodden with blood, the congealed mess already starting to blacken. It was as if his heart had stopped beating. He had seen so much death, had experienced the full horror of the slaughter of battle, yet he had never seen anything that came close to matching the staring eyes of the dead child. Armourer placed her hands on his face, turning him to her, forcing his gaze away from the dreadful sight. "Jack, we're going." There was an edge to her voice, a commanding tone he had not heard before. He let himself be led, his rage lost in the warmth of her touch. He stumbled after her like a toddling child rushing to keep pace with its mother. She pulled him off the street into a dark passage that ran alongside the nearest Kothi. She hauled him into the shadows, hiding them both in the darkness. Jack heard the chasing mob reach the carnage they had just left. He listened to the roar of approval as they discovered the bodies of the woman and her child. Armourer placed her hands back to his face, cradling him and holding him fast. She stood on tiptoe and smothered his lips with her own. There was nothing tender in the kiss, their touch containing neither love nor lust. He pulled her to him, the need to be close to another living being both urgent and demanding. He felt her damp skin against his, her tears streaming down her face to mingle with his own. He did not let her go, continuing the kiss, sharing the anguish and deadening the misery in the warmth of her embrace. The devil's wind had reached Delhi, and it had unleashed something dreadful that neither understood. They clung to each other lest their souls somehow be lost in the tempest. Chapter 9. Jack stuck his head round the corner of the dank alley. They had been hiding there for what seemed like hours, listening to the pandemonium of a city gone mad. The dusty street was empty save for the bodies of the dead. The ground was decorated with blood, now black and congealed, and the torn pages of books billowed in the breeze. Not a single house was untouched, the gruesome bloodlust forgotten in a wave of looting and theft as the citizens of Delhi engaged in an orgy of destruction. Jack had no idea why. He turned and called Armourer forward. He saw the dirt encrusted on her face, streaked with pale stretches where her tears had cut a path through the grime. He took her hand and held it tight. He hefted his revolver in his free hand. He had left their hiding place a while earlier, risking his life to retrieve his fallen weapon. His hands had been shaking as he went through the ritual of reloading the 5 chambers, but the familiar routine had reassured him, a trace of normality amidst the chaos. He led her away from their hiding place cautiously. He did not look at the bodies or at the blood-stained ground beneath his boots. His eyes scanned the street, watchful for danger. "Soldiers!" Amra's voice broke the silence. Her relief was obvious. She had every right to feel reassured. Up ahead, 3 streets came together to form a small open space, and Jack saw a column of sepoys standing in the ordered ranks of a formed body of men. The sight of the regular company troops in their bright red jackets was wonderfully familiar. He had seen men like these in battle. They were doughty fighters. Even in the maelstrom of the worst encounter, he would not hesitate to have them on his flank. He knew that the sepoys would make short work of the bands of murderers and cutthroats who had revelled in the bloody riot. "Thank God," Armour exhaled, sensing that they had found salvation. She made to step forward, her arm already raised to hail the closest sepoys. Jack held her back, first stopping her, then forcing against the wall and back into the shadows. She opened her mouth, but he hushed her with a single finger placed on his lips. One look at the expression on his face assured her of his seriousness, and she shrank back into the gloom, any thought of deliverance dying as the horror returned. "Something's not right." He hissed the words as he studied the ranks of red-coated soldiers. They were not wearing their regulation uniform trousers, but there was nothing odd in that alone. The native soldiers would often swap the heavy dark blue trousers for the more comfortable dhotis that the soldiers in front of them were wearing, especially when on a working party. Nor was the absence of the regulation leather stocks a matter for concern. Most battalion commanders would allow their men to forgo wearing the uncomfortable and constricting collar that forced their chins high and into what their masters at Horse Guards considered a suitable martial pose. Yet still Jack sensed something was wrong. The sepoys began to move, starting off without a visible command, the men chattering to their fellows without pause. They ambled away, the ranks staying together, but with a lack of military discipline that no respecting havildar or subadar would ever allow. Jack looked for the men's officers, but could see none present, either white or native. The sepoys appeared to be alone. He counted the ranks and calculated that he was looking at more than 3 complete companies. He was too far away to be able to work out which regiment they belonged to, but he was certain that such a large body of men would never be left without even a single officer to command them. A huge cheer erupted from the ranks. A second group of sepoys had arrived. and their appearance reinforced Jack's suspicions that they were not the formed, disciplined body needed to put down the bedlam that had gripped Delhi. The newly arrived sepoys thrust a pathetic huddle of men, women and children in front of them. These were no Farangi, but natives who looked no different from any in the crowds Jack had seen the previous night. The captives were forced to march at bayonet point, and even from where he watched from the shadows, he could see blood on many of those who had been captured by the very men who should have been protecting them. "I don't understand." Amara pressed against his side. Her hoarse whisper quivered as she spoke, the fear taking her firmly back into its merciless grip. "They live here. How can they treat them so?" Jack said nothing. He could not answer her. A tall sepoy prowled around the group of prisoners, who huddled together, clinging to one another as they faced their fate. He was clearly mocking them, his shouted curses and insults carrying to where Jack and Amara watched in silence. The sepoy reached forward and pulled a man out by his neck. The unfortunate prisoner struggled, but the sepoy merely laughed and threw him to the ground. Then, to the guffaws and cheers of his fellows, he reached forward and tugged the man's trousers away, revealing his bare buttocks. Jack heard the shouts of encouragement as the tall sepoy pulled the bayonet from his belt. The 17 inches of steel glinted in the sun as the sepoy thrust it downwards, ramming it into the helpless man's backside. The scream that followed barely sounded human, yet even such a desperate cry was drowned out by the wave of cruel laughter that greeted his inhuman treatment. The tall sepoy reached down and fumbled around the man's neck, ignoring the feet that thrashed in the dust, and tore something away. With a theatrical gesture of triumph, he held aloft the man's crucifix, brandishing it at his fellows, his face contorted with fury. Then he turned, raging at the huddle of terrified prisoners who shrank away from him, pressing closer together as if they could somehow escape the inevitable. Screaming insults, the tall sepoy threw the crucifix to the ground and crushed it beneath his sandaled foot. Then, with a roar, the rest of the sepoys closed on the citizens of Delhi who had been foolish enough to convert to Christianity. Jack turned away. He would not watch as the sepoys butchered the innocent people with their bayonets, the drill taught by their British instructors now put to such a vile purpose. Amara pulled at his hand, leading him away. "Those poor people. Why are they doing it?" Her free hand went to her throat, her fingers carefully taking hold of the crucifix she wore. "I don't know." The reply was lame, even to his own ears. He watched her closely and saw her fingers tense, as if about to rip the slender gold chain away. He reached forward and gently placed the crucifix back against her skin, carefully folding her clothes around it. "I will keep you safe. I swear." He gave the promise willingly, but not lightly. He had learnt to his cost what it was to make a vow only to see it count for naught against the power of fate. Yet he would die before he failed to keep this one. Amara searched his eyes. She nodded slowly, as if reading some deeper meaning in the intense grey stare that locked onto her own. "Where shall we go?" "You tell me. Where will there be British soldiers?" She closed her eyes. She was clearly in shock, and he squeezed her hand, trying to offer some reassurance. "The magazine. There will be British troops there." He nodded, accepting her choice without a murmur. "So be it. This time, you'd better lead." He fixed her with a grim smile. He was rewarded with a flicker of one of her own. They walked slowly and carefully, sticking to the shadows. At the first hint of any noise, they hid, using the alleyways and dark corners to screen themselves from view. It made for laborious progress, and Jack chafed at the slow pace, but whenever he felt his temper start to fray, he only had to recall the mob's hatred to remind him of what was at stake. "Those soldiers." Armour broke the silence. The slow pace of their tortuous path gave them enough breath to speak. Jack sensed her need to talk. "They weren't soldiers. Not anymore." He kept his voice low as he corrected her. "Then what were they? What has happened?" He felt the prick of fear as he thought about the sepoy's actions. He had served with men from the East India Company's army. He knew a little of the dissatisfaction in their ranks, the rumours of discontent at the new breed of company officer who no longer bothered to learn anything about their troops. But all soldiers groused and moaned, no matter the colour of their uniform or the tone of their skin. He had thought of it as being no more serious than the daily complaints of the redcoats he had once commanded. He had not understood that it could lead to something as terrible as the events he had witnessed that day. Jesus! He hissed the blasphemy through gritted teeth as he thought of the consequences. What? He was shaking his head, understanding the danger. If one native regiment had mutinied, then perhaps others would follow their lead. A few thousand British officers, soldiers, and officials governed a population that outnumbered them by tens of thousands. Something had happened to turn the tables. Like a man whose pocket had been picked by a buzzer, the locals had finally awoken to the fact that they had been robbed, the thin veneer of civilized society torn away to reveal the tawdry truth hidden behind its facade. "Jack?" Armour pulled him to a halt as she heard the sound of movement. They slipped behind a gate, crouching in the shadows. "What's happening?" Jack paused, listening for the sound of footsteps. He heard nothing, but still replied in a whisper. "The sepoys we saw must have mutinied. If they've acted alone, then there are enough soldiers in the area to restore control. And if there are more," he heard the catch in her voice, "then the whole damn country is going to fall apart." "But it can't be that bad. We only saw a few soldiers. The rest are just scum. Charmers, not people." "Charmers? What are they?" Armour's face twisted with distaste. "We call them the Untouchables. They are nothing more than bandits, like the ones you killed. They are always there, but usually they dare not come out in daylight. They feed on one another and on anyone foolish enough to come into their part of town. They are bad men." Her explanation made sense. It would account for the improvised clubs. Legs from a charpoy, bamboo lathes, and simple planks of wood were not the weapons of organised mutiny. Armour could be right. If one regiment had mutinied, it might well have inspired the lower classes to riot. Jack felt his fear begin to subside. Perhaps doomsday had not arrived after all. But he still had to get them to safety. "It's over there." Jack followed the line of Armour's pointing finger. The last part of their journey had seemed to take forever. They had been forced into detour after detour, often turning away from their destination to avoid parties of mutinous sepoys or gangs of charmers who were roaming the city searching for loot, or for a target to slake their desire for murder. Now, hours later, they could finally see the entrance to the magazine, the main British arsenal in the district, which was stocked with enough cannon, rifles, muskets, powder and shot to supply an army. "Bugger," Jack cursed. They were too late. A great swarm crowded around the two tall crenellated towers that guarded the approach. Some looked to be sepoys, but it was hard to be sure as so many were in a state of undress. A large number wore kurtas and dhotis, and almost all had swords tucked into their belts and an array of carbines, pistols, and muskets in their hands. Most of the crowd were yelling and brandishing their weapons whilst the smoke from dozens of nearby fires billowed and twisted around them. It was pandemonium. As Jack watched, the mob smashed the last of the lanterns that lit the approach to the armory. They were roaring in frustrated impotence, and through a gap in the crowd he could see that the main gate to the magazine was firmly barred shut. Behind it, the gaping mouths of 2 6-pounder cannon pointed threateningly outwards, and he could just make out the presence of at least 2 men manning them. If the cannon were loaded with canister, they would deter even the most ardent mutineer from coming close. A canister shell was a tin packed full of musket balls. It turned the cannon into little more than an enormous shotgun, capable of killing dozens with a single shot. The sound of hooves echoed loudly, and Jack pulled Armourer out of sight as a body of cavalry trotted past. They were as badly turned out as the sepoys in front of them, and he was beginning to wonder just how many regiments had become caught up in the madness that had taken hold of Delhi. He poked his head out of their hiding place in the shadows behind an abandoned bullock cart and risked a glance so that he could watch the arrival of the horsemen. The mutinous cavalry scattered the crowd, even the hottest heads in the mob wise enough to get out of the way of the heavily armed troop, who appeared in no mood to stop. He looked across at Armourer. He could see the strain on her face. He could think of only one option, one way of reaching the sanctuary of the armory. She would not like it, but there was nothing else. Ready? She looked aghast. Ready for what? For this. He grabbed her arm and pulled her into the open. You crazy fool! He ignored the gasped insult. He felt the sun catch him the moment he left the shadows. It scorched his skin, and for a heartbeat he was blinded by the glare. But there was no time to stop. His boots pounded into the dusty ground, every step appearing to take an age. It was as if he was wading through the heaviest mud rather than a thin layer of dirt. Still he ran on, laboured step by laboured step, the distance seeming to stay the same no matter how much he strained. He could hear Armourer's gasps as he hauled her behind him, tiny sobs of fear breaking out every few strides. Cries of anger and alarm erupted on both sides. Jack had tried to time his break from cover to make the most of the disruption caused by the arrival of the rebel cavalry, but he could already see figures moving to intercept them, even though they had yet to cover half the distance to the magazine. "Open the gate!" From somewhere he found the breath to shout the order. He heard the panic in his voice, but he did not care. He felt his arm jarred backwards as Armourer stumbled. He hauled her forward mercilessly, ignoring the scream of pain as he pulled her arm half out of its socket in his haste to get her to safety. "Open the fucking gate!" he bellowed again. But this time the command was cut off abruptly as a figure leapt out at him from his left-hand side. He caught the flash of a sword as a blade was swung hard, but there was no time to react even as he felt the blade whisper through the sleeve of his shirt as he careered past. He had gambled both their lives on a madcap dash to the gate. It was all or nothing. "Open the gate!" He screamed the words, pleading for reaction. He saw the 2 white faces turn his way, the wide-eyed stares of the gunners as the pair ran at full speed towards the gate they guarded, a gate that remained resolutely barred. Chapter 10. Jack and Armourer careered to a halt in front of the barred gate. Jack was panting, his breath coming in tortured gasps. He thrust Armourer behind him, pushing her hard into the railings, and drew his sword. He turned to face the onrushing horde, sheltering her behind him in one last futile gesture. "Open the gate!" He heard Armora screaming behind him, her voice shrill. Then the first sepoy was on him, and the time for hope died. His gamble had failed. A bayonet was thrust hard at his belly. It was just as he had expected. He knew the drill as well as any redcoat. He slashed his tulwar across his body, battering the sepoy's bayonet-tipped musket to one side. He saw the look of horror flash across his enemy's face as the sepoy realized what had happened. Then he stamped forward, thrusting the point of his sword hard into the man's breast. He twisted his wrist even as he threw his full weight behind the blow. He could feel the suction of the flesh grip the blade, and he rotated the sword, ripping it from the body's bloody grip. The man fell, and Jack immediately stepped backwards, his only thought to hide Armora for as long as possible. Men came at him in a rush, their swords and bayonets reaching for him from every direction. He roared his defiance and battered the blades away. He jabbed the tulwar forward, keeping it moving quickly. It forced the nearest men backwards, giving him an opening. Without hesitation, he stepped into the space he had created. The men who had been rushing towards him stumbled back, their easy victory snatched away by the fast-moving blade. He backhanded the sword, bringing it around in a glittering arc before burying the edge in a sepoy's neck. The man fell with a scream, his body blocking more of the advancing bayonets. "Jack!" He barely heard his name through the roar of blood in his ears. It meant nothing. The rage of battle seared through him, and he stamped his feet down, careless of the ruined flesh beneath his boots. He smelt the bitter tang of spilt blood, and it fired his fury. Again and again he slashed at the men crowding ever closer. He beat aside bayonet after bayonet, gouging huge splinters in the muskets thrust at him. He was bellowing with madness as he fought, the sound little more than a snarl of defiance. Another sepoy fell to the ground, his throat snatched away by the tip of Jack's tulwar. His screams were lost in the wild melee, his thrashing body failing to trip more of his fellows even as they backed away from the fiend who would not accept the inevitability of his death. "Jack! For God's sake, get down!" He heard Armora screaming at him. Her voice came as if from far away. There was no time to dwell on her command. 3 bayonets came at him from his flank, their owners grunting as they thrust hard at the hated Ferangi who fought with such wild abandon. He swung his sword round, a wild, desperate parry, knocking the bayonets away, keeping himself safe for a moment longer. There was the smallest of openings, and he slammed his free hand forward, punching it into the heavily bearded face of one of his attackers. He saw the man stumble away, but more pressed hard behind him, their bayonets already reaching forward. Jack's bitter defiance was about to come to an end. "Jack, get down!" This time the order came with a hard push into his spine. He fell to the ground, a bayonet whispering past his face, the anguished roar of a frustrated sepoy the last sound he heard before an enormous explosion roared over his head. Bodies fell all around him. The screams were dreadful as the storm of musket balls released by the single cannon shot tore men to pieces, a great shower of blood and offal raining down like hot mist. His hearing was lost in the violent explosion, but he felt strong hands pulling at him, and he staggered to his feet. His legs were barely capable of bearing his weight, but he was held up and half carried, half dragged through the iron gate and into the safety of the magazine's entrance, where he was dumped onto his backside without ceremony. He caught a glimpse of a bearded gunner rushing away to join his mate, who was slamming the gate shut behind them. Jack, are you all right?" He could barely make out the words. his battered eardrums still thrumming with the violence of the explosion. Armourer grabbed his arms, pushing him to one side so that he was out of the way of the gunners. "Jack!" He saw her mouth form his name, but the sound was deadened and flat. He shook off her grip and let his head hang between his legs, his back pressing into the wall of the magazine's entrance. He still held his tulwar, his hand clenched tightly round the hilt. Outside, the mob was running. Dozens of their number lay on the ground in front of the gate. At such close range, the cannon fire had been brutally effective. The canister shell had exploded as it left the gun's barrel, spreading a wanton and bloody destruction through the dense crowd. The proximity of so much death made Jack realize just how close he had come to meeting his own. Had any of the sepoys had a loaded musket, he would likely have been gunned down, his body lying now in the tangle of twisted corpses. He shuddered, then dropped his tulwar and vomited, his guts heaving with a final spasm of fear. The violent scourge seared through him as he expelled the horror of the desperate fight. The wave of nausea left him, and he spat hard before he lifted his head and looked up at the girl he had so nearly led to her death. "I'm sorry." His voice was thick with phlegm, and he spat again before using the sleeve of his shirt to wipe away the worst of the snot, blood, and vomit that streaked his face. Amara bent down so that she was level with him. She placed a warm hand on either cheek and pushed her own face forward so that it was no more than an inch from his. "You are a fool, Jack Lark," she said, before kissing him full on the lips. "Would someone kindly tell me what the devil is going on?" Armourer pulled away, and Jack looked up to see the face that owned the voice with its peremptory tone. A British officer wearing the uniform of a lieutenant of the Bengal artillery came striding towards them, his jowly face creased into a scowl. "Have you come from Brigadier Graves? I've been asking for help all day." Jack eased himself to his feet. He knew he looked dreadful. Blood soaked one sleeve of his once white shirt, whilst the other was smeared with muck from where he had wiped his face clean. His trousers were splattered with gore and filth, and there were several rents and tears in the fabric. He looked like a vagabond. "Jack Lark." He offered his hand as the lieutenant stomped closer. The officer looked hard at the hand, caked in blood, before reaching forward and shaking it with surprising enthusiasm. "Lieutenant George Willoughby. I command here." Jack acknowledged the introduction with a curt nod of his head. Willoughby was an undistinguished-looking man. He was short and rather wide, with dark hair slicked into a side-parting that was still perfect despite the chaos of the day. A set of twin moustaches bristled under his bulbous nose, which twitched with barely concealed distaste as he took in Jack's bedraggled appearance. Jack bent and retrieved his fallen sword, thrusting it into its leather scabbard before turning to introduce Armourer. Willoughby's pudgy face creased into a wide grin as he looked across at Jack's companion. He bowed at the waist before stepping forward to lift her hand and press it to his lips. "I am delighted to make your acquaintance, Miss Armourer." With obvious reluctance, he released her hand and turned his attention back to Jack. "So, Mr. Lark, I confess I do not think we've met. Are you newly arrived in Delhi?" "Yes, I'm a civilian. I arrived yesterday." Jack was as polite as he could manage, but the introduction hurt. He was a reluctant civilian. In his eyes, a man with neither rank nor station counted for little. Willoughby's brow furrowed. He looked past Jack, studying the scene beyond the gate. "You fought like a soldier." Jack said nothing as the British officer contemplated the pair who had arrived so dramatically. Finally, Willoughby nodded. "And now is not the time for questions. Come, let me get you out of harm's way, although I fear you may regret your choice of refuge. I do not think anywhere is going to be safe much longer, here least of all." The lieutenant led them into the open space at the centre of the magazine. Jack walked at his side, his eyes roving over the paltry defences. The two men manning the pair of cannon at the armory's main entrance seemed to know what they were about, but it would take many more to deal effectively with any determined attack. Half a dozen servants stood in a sullen group, shiny new Enfield rifles held reluctantly in their hands. They appeared to have been assembled as some kind of flying squad, held ready to react to any incursion over the walls of the magazine. If that was all that stood between the British and defeat, Jack did not feel confident. As Willoughby approached, the servants flashed angry glares in his direction, muttering to one another in low voices, their discontent clear even to a stranger. Behind the reluctant soldiers, 4 more guns were lined up, facing off in a semicircle so that they could cover most of the walls, and he could see another pair guarding a second entrance on the far side of the courtyard. Should any mutinous sepoys breach the magazine's defences, they were guaranteed a warm reception. However, there was no team ready to reload the cannon. Just half a dozen men and officers from the Ordnance Department, who bustled around making final preparations for the defence. Such a small group would be hard-pressed to keep the guns firing once any battle had begun. They reached the entrance to the main magazine, and Willoughby led them into an office. It was a relief to be out of the relentless sun, but the small room was stuffy to the point of feeling like an oven. Willoughby was too agitated to sit, so he waved Jack and Armourer to the only available chairs. Armourer sat down heavily, drained and exhausted. Jack ignored the offer. He shrugged his knapsack from his shoulder and dumped it on the floor before tossing his revolver onto the desk, then grunted as he was forced to pull hard to free his tulwar from its scabbard. A thick layer of blackened blood had stuck it to the leather liner, and he grimaced as he saw the state of the blade. He looked around for something to clean it on, and his eyes lighted on a multicoloured pagdi hanging on a peg near the room's only window. He grabbed it and began the laborious task of scraping the steel clean. Willoughby scowled at Jack's casual use of his possessions. He opened his mouth to protest, but clearly thought better of it as he caught the look in the grey eyes that flickered his way. "What's going on, Willoughby?" asked Jack. He was in no mood to be polite. "Have the company's troops refused to obey their officers?" "You could say that, old boy, but I dare say it's a bit more serious than that." Willoughby looked at him. "Did you say you were a civilian?" "I did." Jack was curt. He had no intention of discussing his past. "How serious?" "Oh, serious as it damn well gets." Willoughby grimaced at his slip of the tongue. My apologies, ma'am." He bobbed his head in regret. "Out with it, man." Jack was quickly losing patience with Willoughby's manner. His first opinion of the portly officer was not a good one. The lieutenant seemed old for his rank, something that was common in the East India Company, which was often officered by men who had been unable to secure a commission in the regular army. Without the right level of finance, a company officer could easily find his career stalled and his chances of promotion slim. Willoughby appeared to be just such an officer, and Jack had little desire to put up with a lot of shilly-shallying when he was desperate to know what had happened to throw the city into such chaos. "It's mutiny, plain and simple." Willoughby was clearly uncomfortable with Jack's direct style, but he did his best to answer the question. "The whole bally lot of them have killed their officers, and now they're killing anything that moves, men, women and children. Anyone with a white face is being hunted down and murdered." His eyes flickered nervously in Armourer's direction as he continued. "There are rumours that they're using the women in the most abominable way." "Is it just here in Delhi?" Jack was stunned by the news. He had suspected that the sepoys had mutinied, but it still shocked him to hear it confirmed. "I've no idea. I haven't had contact with anyone for hours now. The whole damn country could be up in arms for all I know." "What troops have you got here?" Jack grunted in satisfaction as he finished removing the worst of the dried blood from the sword. He turned his attention to his arm. The sting of the wound he had taken in the mad dash to the magazine was still bright, but as he peered through the rent in his shirt, he could see it was little more than a scratch that was already scabbing over. He could afford to leave it a while longer. "I have 2 officers, Lieutenants Forrest and Rayner." Willoughby answered the question in a clipped tone. "Both are experienced men. Then there are 6 employees of the Ordnance Department, and that number again of servants." "That is all?" Jack shot Armourer a frosty glare as he realized that her advice to seek out the magazine might have led them into more trouble. "Indeed. I've ordered the servants to be armed, and I've positioned 8 6-pounders as best I can. All are double-shotted with canister." "Where are the nearest reliable troops?" Willoughby rolled his eyes in a theatrical gesture that was cut short when he saw the look on Jack's face. "There are none. As far as I know, all the native regiments in the city have mutinied. There are no British regiments here in Delhi. Other than the officers, there is no one we can rely on. The nearest available troops are at Meerut." Jack took the news in silence. He considered the situation before he spoke again. "So we are holed up here, with barely a dozen men against a few thousand mutinous sepoys, together with as many ruffians, thieves, and murderers as care to join the damn party. Now look here." Willoughby bristled at Jack's tone. He came closer and dropped his voice as if confiding some great secret. "This is the biggest damn magazine in the whole country. We have enough muskets, rifles, field guns, ammunition, and powder to supply an entire army. All we have to do is hold out until nightfall. Then the bloody rabble outside will skulk off and go back to looting the city, leaving us in peace, until we're reinforced by whatever reliable troops my fellow officers are able to rustle up. They will not leave us to rot here. They know how important this place is. We simply have to hold until we're relieved." "Do you really think you can do so with 2 officers, 6 men, and 6 servants?" Jack's opinion of the likely success of the defence was clear in his tone of voice. "I think so, yes. That lot out there don't have ladders or cannon." Willoughby scowled at Jack's lack of confidence. "They simply cannot get in here. If they somehow manage to scale the walls, we will greet them with a volley of canister. That should make them think twice. And if any manage to survive, I've ordered a large number of brand-new Enfields to be loaded and held ready. Even though we're few in number, we shall not have to reload. As long as we remain steady, we'll be able to bring down a heavy fire, so yes, I believe we can hold." Jack saw the look of determination on Willoughby's face. It was a good plan, and for the first time he began to understand the lieutenant's confidence. Willoughby had few men, but he had a whole arsenal at his disposal, and he was making the most of the resources available to him. What if you're wrong? What if that is not enough? Willoughby matched Jack's laugh with a grim smile. "Then I will follow the only course of action open to me." Jack felt his first opinion of the artillery officer start to fade. Willoughby might look like a bag of piss and wind, but there was steel beneath the blubber. "And what course of action is that?" "Then I will fire the magazine." The lieutenant saw Jack's expression, and his smile stretched wider. "I'll blow the whole bally lot to kingdom come." Chapter 11. "Sir." A grey-haired officer wearing the uniform of a lieutenant arrived to interrupt Willoughby's briefing. "Oh, we have need of you outside." Willoughby nodded at the abrupt summons. "Very well, Forrest." He turned to Jack. "Mr. Lark, this is Lieutenant Forrest. Forrest, this is Mr. Lark and Miss Armourer. Jack ran his eyes over the aging lieutenant. The man looked at least 50 and was probably older. The magazine was precisely the kind of posting an officer received when he possessed neither the influence nor the money to progress up the ranks. Forrest might be a capable officer, but without either of those crucial advantages, his destiny was to become marooned in some out-of-the-way posting where he would serve out his years on the paltry income of a junior officer. Forrest was staring at Jack. I saw you fight your way in, Mr. Lark. I've never seen anyone as quick as you were with that blade. You certainly know how to handle a sword, even if it is a heathen's talwar. In the face of such sincere praise, Jack was uncomfortable. It was nothing. I did what had to be done, no more. The lieutenant frowned, his eyes never leaving Jack. As you wish, sir. He used the honorific without hesitation. He turned to face his commander. A detachment of Baudar Shah's guards are at the gate. They are demanding we surrender the magazine. We will do no such thing. Willoughby puffed out his cheeks at the bold demand. Mr. Lark, would you care to accompany us? Miss Armourer, you are welcome to use my office. I suggest you get some rest while you can. I have a feeling things might get a little hotter round here shortly. Jack looked at Armourer. She was sitting hollow-eyed and pale. He caught her eye and saw her exhaustion. He tried a smile. Do you want to stay here? I'll not go far. To his surprise, she nodded. It was a sign of her fatigue that she acquiesced so readily. He followed the two lieutenants out of the shady interior and back into the scorching sun. It was only late morning, but already the heat was stupefying. The power of the sun made Jack once again doubt Willoughby's confidence that his small garrison could hold through the rest of the long day and on into the night. It would take all of a man's strength simply to survive the heat, let alone repel a series of determined attacks. He looked round, seeking a way out of the magazine, an escape route to get himself and Armourer away before the tiny company was overrun. Willoughby saw his scrutiny and took it for something else. It's over there, by the tree in the centre of the yard. I thought it as good a place as any. For a moment, Jack didn't understand what the lieutenant was referring to. He looked across to the tree he had indicated and spotted a thin trail of dark grey powder leading across the dusty yard and into the mouth of what could only be the main storeroom. Willoughby had been deadly serious. The preparations were in place to fire the magazine. Jack could not imagine what would happen if one of them lit the fuse, but he was certain he wanted to be a very long way away before a few £1,000s of powder blew up. They reached the main gate, and Jack saw the uniformed detachment of the Emperor's guards waiting just outside. They looked like a smart troop, with tightly bound scarlet pagdis that matched the thick sashes around their waists holding their tulwars in place. A finely dressed young man led the detachment. He was little more than a boy, but he regarded the three Englishmen with arrogant disdain. You are Willoughby. The man raised a thin finger and pointed it at Forrest. Forrest bristled. No. He inclined his body towards Willoughby. Sir, I believe the gentleman is talking to you. Willoughby stuck out his chest and walked forward. Good morning. How may I assist you? If he was put out by the guard commander's rudeness, it did not show in his polite greeting. The young commander scowled at his mistake. You are Willoughby. You will give me the magazine. Willoughby chuckled. I really don't think that is possible, young man. The magazine is the property of the Crown. The younger man's face was twisting in anger. You will do as I say. We are taking the magazine in the name of the Shah. He rules here. It is rightfully his property. Is it now? All trace of good humour left Willoughby's voice. Go and tell the king that his people are committing murder. If he rules here, then he is responsible for the foulest outrage, and he must put a stop to it this instant. When peace has returned and my senior officers send me verifiable orders, then, and only then, will I be prepared to unbar this gate. The portly officer was shaking with barely controlled anger as he finished speaking. His face was flushed scarlet with the passion of his words, and his hands had balled into fists. His speech was welcomed with nothing more than a sneer. You are a stupid, fat little man. I shall take great pleasure in watching you die. With that, the commander of the guard turned on his heel and stomped away, his detachment following in his wake. Well done, sir. Forrest spoke with approval. You gave that bugger what for. Willoughby was still rigid with anger. The impudent cur! Does he expect me to stand meekly aside? Jack was less agitated. No, I rather think he expects you to die. Forrest and Willoughby turned to look at their newly arrived guest, an expression of shock on both their faces. Did you see what was going on behind that bastard's back? Jack met their scandalised glares with calm detachment. Willoughby coughed in discomfort. No, I was watching the fellow's face. What did I miss? You were wrong. They do have ladders. Lots of them. Jack took no pleasure in revealing what he had spotted. You should prepare for their attack. Willoughby and Forrest turned in unison. There was nothing for them to see. Beyond the iron gate, all was calm. Even the hostile crowd had withdrawn. It is the calm before the storm, then? Forrest spoke in reverential tones. The three men looked at one another. So be it. Willoughby broke the spell. He fixed Jack with a grim smile. I take it that you will not be joining us at the dance? Jack's face was cold. It's not my fight. I'm a civilian, not a soldier. He felt the urge to spit, the bitter words leaving a sour taste in his mouth. He had left the army behind. He was no longer tied to it, his only duty to himself and to Armourer. Willoughby shared a look with his lieutenant. He did not say a word, simply gave a curt nod and walked away without giving Jack a second glance. I think I know a way out that you can use. It will be dangerous, but I expect you know that. Forrest spoke in clipped, business-like tones. There was no recrimination. Whatever the aged lieutenant felt was hidden behind the dignified facade of a British officer. Jack nodded. He had nothing more to say. He followed Forrest as they walked away from the barred gateway, away from the enemy that was preparing to attack. We're leaving. Armourer greeted Jack's news with surprise. The old lieutenant has shown me a way out. It won't be easy, so we need to go now. Jack gave the order coldly. He was already planning their escape. Forrest had shown him a small group of wooden storage sheds that butted up to the east wall of the magazine. If they were quick, Jack and Armourer could use them as a way to get up and over the wall. The lieutenant had no idea what would await them on the other side, but at that moment it was as good an escape route as they would find. You're abandoning them? Jack scowled at the accusatory tone in her voice. Yes. They will be overrun. They don't stand a chance in hell. Now get your things. He turned away, hiding his face. It's because of me, isn't it? Armourer would not let him go. She was on her feet, grabbing at his arm, forcing him to face her. You are doing this because of me. Jack turned on her, his face set like thunder. You want to stay here and die? Be my bloody guest. He shrugged off her hand and snatched his revolver from the desk. Do not shout at me. Armourer's face was flushed with fury. I did not ask for you to become my guardian. But I bet you're bloody glad I did. I've saved you twice. Now I'm about to do it again." Jack was sarcastic, his words biting. "Do not take that tone with me." Armourer came after him. "This is not my fault. Isn't it? Because it sure ain't mine." "You think you would have got here without me? You were lost. You didn't know where to go." Her voice was rising in anger now, rage mixing with fear to produce an explosive cocktail, one as potent as the store of powder not more than a dozen paces away from where they argued. "I'm only in Delhi because of you, you daft bint. I wouldn't have to escape if I wasn't bloody here." "So, you wish you hadn't come? Maybe you should have thought of that before. I didn't hear you complain when you got me on my back." "Neither did you." "You bastard." Armourer slapped him hard. She pulled her hand back to strike him again, but Jack was too quick and too strong. He grabbed her arm, holding it tight. His face came close to hers. "I have to save you. Don't you understand? I cannot let you stay here. I will not see you die." He dropped her hand and turned away, fighting to keep the mask over his emotions. "You would stay if I was not here." Her passion was spent. She had seen the look in his eyes and had finally recognized his fear. It was not for his own life, it was for hers. He said nothing. She walked to him. "You should stay. I promise to keep you safe. I will not let you down." His words were hard, but she understood the feelings that he was failing to hide. "And you think out there is safer than in here?" He turned to face her. I don't know. Nowhere is safe, Jack." She reached for him, her fingers tracing the angry imprint of her hand on his face. "Here, there, it doesn't matter. You have already saved me." For a moment he could not speak. "No, you are wrong." His voice was soft, little more than a whisper. "You saved me." She offered a thin-lipped half-smile. "Then nothing matters, for we have saved each other. We can run, we can hide, we can fight, but we cannot escape our fate, for that is already written." Again Jack found he could not speak. Once he would have denied her words. He had fought fate for as long as he could remember, refusing to accept the life he had been given. Yet now he saw that such actions were futile. He could no more stand against fate than a great king could prevent his children fighting and dying in his name. Against fate, no man could find victory. "So, you think we should stay?" He spoke the words firmly, refusing to let his voice betray him. "Yes, we should stay." She echoed the statement before reaching forward and taking his hands in her own. "We shall face our fate together." The roar was deafening. It was the sound of an army releasing their tension and fear as they screwed their courage tight and began an assault. Jack had heard the sound before. He uttered the soldier's prayer under his breath, begging God to keep him safe, or at the very least to grant him a quick, clean death. Willoughby looked across as if hearing Jack's silent plea. The lieutenant was holding a thin, curved sabre. The blade looked cheap, and Jack doubted the edge was anywhere near sharp enough to slice into flesh, but still he nodded in its direction. "A fine blade." The lieutenant smiled ruefully, like a schoolboy praised by a master for a peculiar arrangement of glue and paper. "I confess I have never had cause to use it, or at least not in anger. I hope that it proves to be up to the job." Jack hid the shudder the revelation inspired. He was fighting with novices. "Don't fence with them." He offered the advice in a quiet voice, but he could not help but notice that both Lieutenant Forrest and Willoughby's other subordinate, Lieutenant Rayner, eased closer to listen to his words. "There are no points or prizes. Hit the bastards like you mean it, especially with that." Willoughby flexed his blade, looking at it as if suddenly unsure it would be of any use. "When you stick them, shove it in their guts as hard as you can." Jack continued his lecture. He found nothing odd in having the 3 older officers pay him such rapt attention. He might have pretended to be a civilian, but they all recognized his familiarity with battle, his dramatic flight to the armory proof of his skill. He was forced to raise his voice as the noise outside doubled in intensity. The sound of hundreds of feet thumping hard into the dusty soil echoed around the quiet yard outside the main magazine store. The wild cheers and yells were loud enough to raise the dead, the inhuman sound of men unleashed to kill washing over the pitiful huddle of defenders. "Then you must twist your wrist," he went on, ignoring the ruckus. "Otherwise the blade will get stuck in the other bugger's body, leaving you defenseless." He looked at each in turn, forcing home the point. He had seen men die because they had forgotten to do exactly that in the dreadful moment when they broke through a foe's defences and landed a killing blow. You pull it out with all your strength, and then you find another ugly bastard and kill him too. You keep going until they've all pissed off. Only then can you stop. He looked at them one last time before he pulled his revolver from its holster, hefting it into his right hand. The metal was hot, scorching his flesh, but he took a firm grip around the trigger nonetheless, and readied himself to fight. "Deuced odd advice from a civilian." Willoughby offered the verdict from the side of his mouth. He turned and chuckled as Forrest and Rayner joined in his merriment. "What trade did you say you were in?" Jack smiled as he replied, "I am currently unemployed." The 3 lieutenants laughed louder, earning them odd looks from the men serving the 4 cannons lined up behind them. "I must thank you for changing your mind." Willoughby was still chuckling as he gave Jack his thanks. "I am grateful that you are staying with us." Jack smiled in return. He had not intended to make this his fight, yet he sensed a building camaraderie with the 3 mismatched officers. It was what he missed most about being a redcoat. The men might fight for their regiment, for the Queen, or in some rare cases for their officers, but mainly they fought for their mates, for the other poor bastards who shared every misfortune that the army and an uncaring world threw at them. The thump of ladders hitting the outside of the magazine's walls ended the laughter. "To your places, please, gentlemen. Mr. Lark, I rather think you can do as you please. Just keep out of the way of the cannon." Willoughby offered his final instructions, and the officers scattered, taking their places as they prepared to defend the magazine. The first figures appeared on top of the wall. There were dozens of them. They flowed quickly over the top, their boots thumping down onto the wooden rampart that ran along its length. Willoughby took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing as he tried to judge the moment to open fire. The attackers were not hanging around. They moved fast, streaming along the rampart and heading for the towers housing the spiral stairs that would give them access to the courtyard and let them take their bayonets to the handful of Farangi officers who stubbornly refused to surrender the magazine. Willoughby coughed once before roaring his first order. "Number 1 and number 3 gun. Prepare to fire." He paused as the 2 men standing ready pulled taut the lanyard that would fire the cannon. The sepoys were spreading out fast, making room for those climbing up behind them. Already the defenders were hopelessly outnumbered, and with every passing second still more men clambered over the wall. "Fire!" The 2 guns roared in unison. Both had been double-shotted with 2 cases of canister rammed on top of a single charge of powder. They bucked as they fired, the canister's casing torn apart as they tore out of the barrel. Hundreds of musket balls shredded the men on the rampart. the deadly hail scouring it clear as it cut a deadly swathe through the fastest attackers. Those brave or foolish enough to have rushed to the fore were snatched away in a single explosion of bloody horror, the head of the assault torn apart. The defence of Delhi's magazine had begun.